Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
Austin. Norman has been married to young Iris for a little over 5 years. The young girl's affair with the middle-aged man did not last long. Austin got used to married life. When his wife filed for divorce and asked to vacate their common house, it was as if the whole world turned upside down for him. Austin could not imagine his life without his family and children. He has to come to terms with the new reality. He also loves his son Eric very much. A couple years after the divorce, Austin was able to buy himself a house in an old village. After buying the house, the first thing he did was take his son Eric to live with him. Eric was very happy to live with his father. They had a lot in common. They communicate like best friends. After some more time, Norman told his son that he was tired of loneliness and wanted to get married. The acquaintance with his new fling took place in a restaurant. Eric hoped to see a woman about his father's age, but a bright young woman came to meet him. She seemed to be the same age as Eric or older by only a couple of years. She was also very pretty. At first glance, Iris seemed like a quiet, calm girl. But it wasn't until a few months later that it became clear to Eric that she wasn't so simple. There is definitely some kind of power in her that conquers people even with a silent look. Eric did not like it, because it was these properties Iris began to interfere with the relationship between father and son. The father began to devote little time to his son. And after all, he now has such a crucial moment in his life. He studies well at the university, began to develop his business in parallel. He really needs a good companion. And the father spends all his free time with his young wife. One day there was an event that made Norman reconsider his attitude to his son and to his young wife. Norman had his own brokerage firm, with an office located in the central part of the city. It was only an hour's drive from the township of Istock. After lunch, Norman felt that he didn't feel like working at all, so he decided to come home early, and he was not expected home at that moment. Change his shoes in the hallway. Norman heard Iris and Eric talking. "Eric, have you thought about the baby? He's gonna want to know the truth later. And anyway, I don't think it's fair," Boris said. "Don't worry, I'll think of something. The main thing is that nobody knows about it yet. By the way, how are things going with that issue? Any progress?" Eric asked. "I'm watching. Everything is going according to plan. No one's really trying to take your place," said Iris. At that moment, Norman came into the kitchen. Iris was happy to see her husband early and kissed him and invited him to the table. Eric was less friendly. He wished his father and stepmother a pleasant evening and left. Norman did not directly ask his wife the gist of the conversation. He decided to handle the matter professionally. A couple of weeks later, a private detective sat in Norman's office and laid out the photos in front of him. "Mr. Norman, we've been able to find out something. It is true that your son and your wife occasionally meet on neutral territory, but we can't yet say what they talk about or what their goals are. We need more time," said the detective. "Well, then keep watching. I expect details as soon as possible," Norman said. The village of Istock is located at the foot of the mountain. It doesn't have many residents, but it has its own atmosphere. There is a good tradition of planting perennial trees wherever possible. Thanks to this tradition, it is always beautiful here. The roads are paved with natural stone. Frequent rains wash away all the dust. Car wheels so polish and these stones that they sparkle at any time of the day. Along the narrow village roads, wardens are set up in treacherous metal and painted in a single calm color. Residents make sure that the pupils' lamps are always clean and working properly. At every turn, along the narrow central road, gazebos made of OREWOD wood have been installed. True, rarely anyone sits there. The people of Stoke are mostly homebodies. They rarely gather outside and do not disturb each other without a reason. Houses are spaced far enough apart for lack of enemies and criminals. The fence here is decorative in nature. The gates are never locked. In the summer, Stoke constantly blows a light breeze, and in the evenings you can hear the flow of the mountain river, to which you can walk for 5 minutes. Along the river, there are green lawns everywhere, on which young people like to hold fun parties at night, and the villagers dislike these visiting parties the most. They disturb their sleep. At the entrance to the village, there is an old chapel, the history of which goes back to the Middle Ages. The chapel has been guarded by a lonely old man all his life. He died recently, and now his faithful four-legged friend, Box, roams around the chapel. But there is no one to watch over the chapel. The villagers have met several times and agreed to take turns guarding the chapel, but no one honors the agreement, and the need to honor the tradition is urgent. It is not even discussed. This is the only pressing problem of this village. There's a second problem for the village, and that's the car ball, and Norman's son Eric. Eric was recently given a new Cadillac by his father. Now he drives his car day and night. Eric has a temper. He likes to make a ruckus and scandal out of nothing. The residents think it's because of his addiction to alcohol and other kinds of stupefied states of mind. But Eric lets everyone know that he doesn't like anyone even sober. Today, as luck would have it, it's Eric's turn to guard the chapel. Freddie, a local activist, has been chasing him around for a week, asking him to remember to come to the chapel in the evening and receive him properly. The other residents laugh at Freddie. How many times do you run after Eric? He still won't come to do this important tradition. Young people are irresponsible these days. They don't honor tradition, and they don't think about the future. This Eric will once again find an excuse to shirk his sacred duty. That's what the villagers of Listock thought. Eric didn't forget his sacred duty. Toward lunchtime, he drove his Cadillac to Freddie's house and asked him to keep the keys to the chapel. At precisely 5:00 p.m., I'll be waiting for you. There's a young man there, Freddie promised. No, that won't do. Come back at 4:00 p.m. I'll be ready to take chapel by then. Also, the next day, you don't have to be here by 900. How do you usually do it? You can come closer to lunchtime. I'm in no hurry to get anywhere, Eric said. Before, he was surprised at the untypical behavior of the local troublemaker, but he interpreted it as a good thing. Suddenly, the young man reconsidered his views and came to his senses. That happens to a lot of people. Everything happened as agreed. Only Freddie was awakened in the night by the screaming of the neighbors. Someone was yelling from the street to call the fire department and the paramedics. As Freddie pulled himself together and ran out of his house, all his neighbors were galloping away. Even yard dogs, small children, and sick old people were running. The chapel's on fire. That's bad luck. The chapel burned more than 180 years ago. Then it was the precursor to a series of floods. And the chapel burned before that, 234 years ago. Immediately after that event, there was a massive earthquake. And then there was a war. A wall and old men clutching at their hearts. That's not good. It shouldn't have happened. We should not have allowed such a significant disaster for our village. The women grumbled. Only Eric sat aside on the curb and took a slow drag on a Cuban cigar, stroking the figure of his friend, who had fallen asleep from the amount of liquor drunk right on the lawn. He had fun watching those pesky people stir and fuss in an attempt to put out the fire. The fools would have slept on. No chapel, no more trouble, thought Eric, and took a big gulp of whiskey straight from the neck of the bottle. The fire was out. People were starting to worry. Where was Norman's son Eric, who was an old-timer that evening? Had the young lad died inside the chapel? Norman had been against having anyone guarding the chapel from the beginning. Freddie had spent an hour talking him down, convincing him that the good traditions of the village must be preserved. How would Freddie look his friend in the eye now? The crowd was stirring again and actively discussing something among themselves. At this point, Eric decided to lie down and rest next to his girlfriend. Eric had hoped that after the fire, the villagers would have no more problems and each of them would live their own lives. But he had clearly underestimated them. 3 days later, they gathered again at the old church and began to discuss how they would rebuild the chapel and how they would protect it from fires. None of them realized that Eric had set the fire on purpose, and he would do it as many times as he wanted. Tired of arguing about rebuilding the chapel, the residents decided to disperse today, and the problem will be solved next weekend when all the residents will feel in the appropriate spirit. Dispersing. Freddie and Norman walked down the main street. Norman hadn't been outside his garden for a long time. Today was the first time he had seen the outskirts of the settlement this year. There used to be an old abandoned house at the end of the street where no one lived. True, old Betty had told everyone that ghosts gathered in that abandoned house every night and held a coven. Nothing else is known about the house. The owners had either moved to town or sold the house. And today Norman noticed a new house 3 times the size of the old one has replaced the old one, and the roof is covered with pizza. In these areas, it was common to use broken skull structures, used by the most noble of families. Freddie, I don't get it. Are they building a new house here? Asked Norman. Don't you know what's going on? Freddie asked in a whisper. They say that the old haunted house bought the billionaire Edgar Nelson himself. He's going to move here, live here. They say he has a little time left. Freddie added. That's it. You're sure it's Edgar Nelson? Why did he choose our village? Asked Norman. Edgar shrugged his shoulders. Nelson was a hero of his era. This man is known for making a huge fortune in his younger years and doing a lot of good for society. After becoming an adult, he began to give lectures to students. Then people realized that Mr. Edgar was not only rich in money, but also in knowledge and wisdom. By his mature years, Edgar Nelson had become a true legend of his time. Even the most influential persons listened to his opinion. Without his participation, no important issue in the country was not solved. And so the people of this village were lucky to have him. Now this man of legend will be their neighbor. No matter how great a man he was, this Edgar Norman for some reason did not feel the joy of a new neighborhood, looking out for all the new residents. It's another tradition of this village. But Mr. Edgar would certainly win all the attention of the locals, and there's no telling what legends they'll start making about him. Norman came home with these thoughts. At that moment he again found his young wife Iris and his son Eric in the living room talking animatedly. Eric, feelings, emotions are all fleeting things. In such matters you have to think with your head and only then take action. You're still very young. You may not know the ins and outs of everything. So follow my advice, Iris says. I'm not only young, I'm handsome. Or don't you agree? Eric seems to be flirting with his stepmother, but it's undeniable. He's a handsome man, Iris tells him. As soon as they heard Norman's footsteps, the conversation stopped. Iris pretended that she had been waiting for her husband for a long time. Eric seemed to be going somewhere. He was dressed smartly and smelled of expensive perfume. It's a little different from his everyday outfit. Dad, you and I need to have a serious talk sometime, Eric said, when he got right to the front door. Let's talk now. I'm free now. While Iris is setting the table for us, said Father. No, another time though. I'm expected now. I'll be late, said Eric, already closing the front door. His last words came from the street. Norman had been trying to keep his cool all evening and not show any signs of jealousy. And Iris kept asking him what he was so excited about and why he was so nervous. Norman only thought that tomorrow the first thing to do was to contact the detective and learn about the progress of surveillance of his closest people. He was afraid to think any further. Dude, why are you so sad? Asked Eric, his friend Jeffrey. As usual, they're out tonight at one of the bars in town. This is Eric Jeffrey's favorite place, his closest friend. Guys don't keep secrets from each other. You know what my home situation and prospects are like, Eric said. Still the same stepmother? Jeffrey asked. Yes, I'm trying to provoke her and find some reason for a scandal. But dude, it's not working. Eric's got his hands up in the air. What about Dad? Jeffrey asked. And he spends all his time with her, as usual. In all likelihood, they're even planning a child. She's young and will have more than one. And then what will be left to me? My father's accounts and business. So it's been losing value over the last few years. And if he has, say, 3 children, it's not an inheritance, but some change for me, Herrick said. So you can't get rid of your stepmother? Jeffrey asked. No, I'm not. I deliberately talk to her about delicate subjects, so that she gets emotionally involved, so that my father will catch her flirting with me. Well, Dad doesn't see or hear all that, Eric said. And try a change of tactics. If verbal and provocation doesn't work on her, then try pretending that you have a crush on her as a woman. Show different signs of attention. Pretend that you are courting her. Trust me, women are addicted to these things. She's gonna let her emotions get in the way of your father. And that's when he'll kick her to the curb. Or maybe he'll think twice and decide to make up with your mother. After all, a woman of her age won't cause as much trouble as a younger woman. Jeffrey's advice. I was thinking the same thing. What if my father decides to take her side and makes an enemy of me? Then I'd lose my chance forever, Eric said. Even if he thinks that, it won't be for long. I know your dad. He's a normal dude. He understands a man's rules well. And men will never fight amongst themselves over a woman. Not even father and son. Even if he gets upset, it'll be for a while. And then you'll make up, Jeffrey said. Meanwhile, to Mr. Norman, the private investigator reported that the surveillance was continuing, but no significant clues could be found. Mr. Norman then decided to do a little investigation of his own. He invited his young wife Iris to a restaurant in the middle of a romantic evening. Norman as if casually began the conversation, Iris dear, I have long been unable to find time to spend with my son. I think he's growing apart from me. What do you think is going on in his life right now? Is there anything bothering him? Mr. Norman asked. That's right, you're really pulling away from him. I think he even blames me for all this, but he talks to me willingly, tells me about his girlfriends. He often consults with me about current affairs. I try to be friendly with him, but realize that no one can take your place in his life. So you should find a way to communicate with him at least once in a while, Iris replied. But overall, what do you think? He's not such a bad guy. I mean, the neighbors like to complain about his difficult personality. He's just like his mom. He's an adult. He can't be changed. Wouldn't his temper get in the way of his relationships with women? Norman asked a leading question. You've given him the best you can. Everyone has their strengths and weaknesses, including your son. I wouldn't say he's hopeless or unbearable. And the neighbors might say that out of jealousy. All in all, you have raised a fine son, Iris replied. After these words, Norman sank deeper into his doubts. His young wife speaks quite positively about his son. Can this be regarded as sympathy? Or is Iris just trying to be polite? Why did he overhear this conversation? The news that Mr. Edgar had already moved into his new home quickly spread through the village, the villagers looking out of their windows to catch a glimpse of the man of legend. The young people were arguing about which automobile he most often drove. This mysterious man interested all indifferent, nay, except Norman. And Iris was home alone when Freddie came in. You and your husband and his son Eric are invited to visit tonight, Freddie said. Secretary Edgar Nelson himself has become our new neighbor. He's throwing a banquet for his housewarming party tonight. He wants to meet everyone in the village, Freddie said. Iris got excited. She remembered the not-too-distant past, and Iris and her friends were just beginning their modeling careers. There was such a secret competition in their circle as dating the cool worms. The most self-confident models boldly put on their list of the most successful men in the country and did not miss a single social party to get acquainted with any of them. And Iris was one such huntress. She had tried several times to make her way into the society of this Mr. Edgar, but she had failed. Then she took a close look at him and decided that he was kind of boring for a legendary person. At the same time, Iris dated various promising guys until she met Norman, an entrepreneur. Unlike the young, spoiled by the female attention of guys, the mature Norman was reliable. He had then already converted his relationship with his wife into an amicable one. According to him, Sarah did not mind it at all. On the contrary, she was glad to finally have her freedom. It was Norman who suffered for family harmony and the usual way of life. That's how spontaneously Iris found herself married to a middle-class businessman. At the moment when she had time to get used to stability in relationships and predictability, right under the side appears such a trophy as Edgar Nelson, and he invites her to visit. Usually these people are very private, and Edgar must have decided that this village is home to ordinary people and not to be shut out. "Oh, honey, we're invited to a banquet tonight at our new neighbor's house," Iris announced over the phone. "Is that old geezer calling?" "No, I'll pass. I'm not gonna waste my time with a con artist like that," Norman said. "What makes you think he's a con man?" "It's all rumors and media speculation. They're usually people just like you and me." "Well, please, let's go." He invited Erica too, insisted, and through. After a long argument, Iris failed to persuade her husband to go together, but he agreed that she would go with Eric. They will briefly sit at the table, exchange a few phrases with this famous man, and then quickly return home. And Iris put on her best dress to meet her new neighbor. That's what all the other neighbors thought. In fact, all of her dresses were just as good. Mr. Edgar was surprisingly indifferent to women's beauty. He didn't even pay much attention to Iris. He thought someone had come with a teenage child. When the guests were served the second hot dish, Mr. Edgar asked for a moment of the audience's attention. Then he stood up and made a statement that left everyone speechless. "I am very happy to be a neighbor to such wonderful people. Believe me, I've lived in a lot of places, and I still do. I'm a pretty good judge of character. You're special. You make for a very interesting life. That's why I chose this village as my final resting place in this world. Few people know that I've been fighting an insidious disease for many years. I know that my outcome is near. Many people have a question about my inheritance. Who will inherit my money? I have no children and no other loved ones. I would like the honor of inheriting from one of you," Edgar said and paused. The guests froze, waiting for him to continue his speech. "But there is one interesting condition. I want to know two special persons among you. The best villager and the worst," said Edgar. The guests looked at each other and began to whisper among themselves. Some laughed, some were puzzled, some thought the old man was joking. "Mr. Edgar, how do you know who among us is the worst and who is the best?" asked the same curious Freddie. "Well, that's what we're going to talk about now. I will draw my conclusions from your feedback. From now on, and for the next 6 months, you can write me letters or come to a personal meeting to tell me about the worst and the best person among you. We will summarize the results in 2 stages. The first stage, in 3 months, we will determine the worst. That is, you can tell me about the worst person first, and for the next 3 months you and I together will look for the best of the best," Edgar said. "What's the point of all this? Is it dismissive?" asked Eric, who until then had been sitting idly watching the others. "Good question, my friend. To the best of you I will give $1 million, and whoever you appoint as the worst will have to guard your chapel for a year. By the way, I've allocated the money to restore it, and now it's a novelty. Do these conditions suit you?" Mr. Edgar asked. "Yes, it's a fascinating game." "I'm curious, why not?" Such phrases were heard from the crowd. Mr. Edgar understood that the audience accepted the terms of the game, and from tomorrow, all the most interesting things begin. And Iris came home in 2 bright feelings. Eric had been incredibly amused. What a quirky old man. He's obviously up to something and wants to fool everyone. And these gullible people believed him. He laughed. When he heard about the bet Mr. Edgar Norman had started, he was once again outraged. I guessed even from a distance that he is not the holy man he claims to be. He is a fraud and an impostor. He came here to sow confusion, grumbled Mr. Norman all evening, and was curious as to what would happen next. It was only a week before Minister Edgar's mailbox was full of letters. No sooner had he read them than people started coming to him themselves to tell him about the worst man in the village. The first was the very same Freddie, a local activist. He came with a whole list. So, Mr. Edgar, I have lived in this village for over 20 years, and I know every resident, and I know their whole background. If you're still interested, you listen. I'm very interested in Freddie telling me everything in detail. I want to know about everyone, Mr. Edgar said and stared at him. One of the worst people, I would say, is Norman Austin. He lives 3 houses down from you. Strange. I don't know anyone like that yet. Mr. Edgar wondered. That's right. He's a very secretive man, settled here only 3 years ago. He bought the house from some old people, remodeled it completely. He's lived here for 3 years, and none of us know anything about him. But we know he's got a young wife. He's got a son with a nasty temper. He's got a dog, that sort of thing. And the rest is a mystery. What exactly do you dislike about him? Mr. Edgar asked. All the other residents don't hide anything from each other. This one leaves early in the morning in his automobile as if from another planet. He arrives late. You don't see him around here much. In our community, normal men go out in the evenings and share the latest news, talk about soccer and women. This mister here is a little too mysterious. I think it's because he's got something to hide. There's a reason he changed his residence and his wife to a new one when he was older. He's obviously got some skeletons in his closet. That's why this man is first on my list. Freddie said. He'll pass, and that's it. Or do you have some kind of personal score to settle with this man? I have personal scores too. I asked him for a loan once. He gave it to me, but I paid him back in time. But you know, I think he gave it to me with such an arrogant look. He obviously thinks badly of us, of the other villagers. For example, when you had your housewarming party, he didn't come to you. Do you know why? Because he treats all people badly. That's another confirmation of what I said. Okay, who else is on your list? Minister Edgar asked. Next on my list is his son Eric, who is a big boy, but he's a troublemaker. His father bought him a brand new Cadillac. So this young man, instead of doing something useful, he rides around in that car all day long. He also tracks down the prettiest girls in our village, has fun with them a couple times, and then forgets about their fate. I suppose these girls will write to you about him in general too. This guy deserves the closest attention, Freddie said. Next on the list. Mr. Edgar listened attentively to his interlocutor. Next on the list is the worst person. I consider this Norman's young wife. And Iris is a model-looking girl who married a man who was old enough to be her father. I think she got together with him for a reason. It must be a matter of calculation. Immorality is a violation of morality. Freddie sounded like the leader of a political movement at a party meeting. Is there anyone else in your disfavor? Mr. Edgar remained at attention. Of course there is. It's our cop Andrew. He's not doing his job well. Mr. Edgar asked. No. No one has any complaints about his duties or his professionalism, but he's not friendly. A year ago, there was an accident at one of the houses. At that time, a cop, Andrew, was working 3 days straight at the house. Now, when I and other villagers came up to him and asked him about the details of the accident, he kept it from us. So this man clearly has bad thoughts about us and is carefully hiding it. So the fourth bad man in this village is a cop, Andrew. So we'll put that down. Who's next? Freddie was so engrossed in his list that he didn't realize a couple hours had passed. He came to his senses when he noticed Mr. Edgar falling asleep in his seat intermittently from his stories. Freddie thought that Mr. Edgar himself must not be such a good person if he couldn't even listen to his fascinating story about all the inhabitants. Mr. Edgar's next visitor was a woman named Grace, who has also lived in this village for over 20 years. She did not have a list. What she did have was the absolute certainty that she was the one who knew the worst person in the village. "This is my ex-husband, Even," Grace said shyly. "He left me with 2 kids and moved into his parents' old house. He lives there alone now. Sometimes he goes to church, sometimes he gets drunk and lies in the street. He absolutely refuses to live with us." Grace said, "In all likelihood, your ex-husband is really not a good man. What would you wish for him?" Mr. Edgar asked. "Can you not be shy in your expressions and thoughts? I guarantee full understanding," added Mr. Edgar. "I would wish for him to suffer just as I suffered in my marriage to him." "Oh, how? I thought you were suffering without him," Mr. Edgar asked. "I suffer without him too, but I suffered with him too. The thing is, I married Ivan early on, but then he went to serve in the army, and from there he came back as a strange man. He lived with us for a while, and then he left." Minister Edgar listened carefully to Grace's words, and the former even wrote something down, then escorted the offended woman home. When there was another free time, Mr. Edgar unexpectedly came to visit the very one who abandoned his family and drags with different women. Even was home alone. He was taken aback by the unexpected guest of honor. In the house there are certainly empty bottles and dirty things lying everywhere. Even himself doesn't look like the happiest person in the world. While Mr. Edgar sat in Evan's living room and watched the arrangement of his space, a certain woman came out of the next room with a perplexed look at Mr. Edgar, then headed sharply toward the exit. Even caught up with her and asked her something. Obviously, he wanted to keep her for a while longer, but the woman was in a hurry. "Ivan, you and I have known each other for a while. I came to see you to get to know you better. How are you doing?" Mr. Edgar asked, and he was at a complete loss. He was very worried about his reputation among people. His departure from the family was received with condemnation by the others. Everyone said he'd be lost without the support of the strong Grace. But Even had his own plans and his own vision of life. He was determined to prove something to the contrary. He needed a little time. Except this visit from Mr. Edgar was not a good idea. There's no telling what he'll tell the others about him. "I've been doing all kinds of things. I live like everybody else. It's true I have some difficulties in my life, but I'll get over them." Even started making excuses. "Don't worry, it's okay. Maybe you could get $1 million from me and rebuild your life. That's what I'm talking about. Your ex-wife came to see me. She thinks you're the worst person in the village because you abandoned your family and moved into your parents' old house. I was curious to see the worst man amongst my own. That is, in fact, what I am here," said Mr. Edgar in a soft tone. And Ivan sat silent for a long time. Mr. Edgar realized that he had stepped on something very painful for this man. He didn't expect the reaction to be so strong. He was clearly distressed about something. "To be honest, my Grace wasn't telling you the whole truth." Finally, Even started talking. "Actually, it all started when I came back from military service. It changed me a lot. I became very nervous, and I had a hard time tolerating others. My wife probably didn't tell you all this. I had a hard time sleeping at night. I kept waking up with nightmares. I told Grace I needed time and space to recover, but she thought I had fallen out of love with her. I walked away from my family to shut them out of my life. I knew that just a little bit more and I could hurt them, raise my hand, or start insulting them. I'm here to sort myself out, to become that calm and upbeat person. I don't know how to do that, but I believe that someday it will happen, and I'll get back to my loved ones. In the meantime, yes, I am a bad person. I know it myself," Even said, and cried like a little child. Mr. Edgar sat in Evan's house for a long time. Eventually he realized that this man had indeed become so small in his soul that he could not stand to be around other people. Mr. Edgar nodded his head repeatedly. When Ivan talked about himself, he had long ago guessed that some events, even insignificant at first glance, can make a person very small in his eyes. Such a person becomes quite embittered. Since the little beast inside is frightened, he is constantly on guard and cannot relax for a minute. Even turned out to be actually not a bad person, and unhappy Mr. Edgar promised to help him in the future. And for himself, he decided that the bad should be sought elsewhere. The next guests surprised Mr. and Edgar very much. There were about 10 of them. They were all teenagers of this village. We found out that you can be told about the best people of this village. If you don't tell our secret to anyone, we are ready to point out the worst person to you, said one of the teenagers. Minister Edgar became very interested. He gave the teenagers the floor and sat in a chair with a pencil and paper in his hands. All the adults in this village are the worst people in the world. They don't understand us. They think we are still children, but we are no longer children, said the first teenager. Then the second of them reached out his hand and stepped forward. Apparently, he too had a problem with adults. And in some cases, we're asked to be adults, even though we're not adults, said the second teenager. What do they want from you? Mr. Edgar asked. The teens hesitated, and each began to list a different thing. They want us to be able to do everything, everywhere. And we don't have any rights. They make us do things we don't like. They make us study subjects that won't do us any good in the future. It's as if they have forgotten that they themselves come from childhood. They steal our freedom and limit our development, the teenagers said with one voice. Mr. Edgar thought deeply. When he announced his bet, he didn't think the kids would be interested in it either. But since the rules were getting complicated, Mr. Edgar decided to accept them. He asked, "And can you specifically give me the names of people who can be categorized as the worst?" That's my mom, Grace. That's my dad, Even, my dad, Freddie, my grandmother, Betty. Our neighbor Norman's teacher, Ted, Mr. Cobb. It seems these young men and women have decided to list all the residents of this village in 3 generations. Mr. Edgar wrote down all the names and then thanked the young activists and escorted them out of his house. The game is gaining very interesting momentum, he said to himself, and shook his head. Mr. Edgar's next destination was the local school. There he got to know the teacher, Ted, better. Just that day, there was a school parent meeting. All the adults who had children, school children, were gathered in the hall. Ted addressed them and outlined a number of problems. They were typical of any school. Ted spoke very emotionally. One of the parents objected to him, demanding even more discipline than there is now. Then Ted said that children should be given more space for freedom, that they have the right to decide about their free time. He also talked a lot about the peculiarities of growing up. From time to time, he reminded the parents that they too were children and experienced difficulties. In the end, the impression was that Ted was completely on the side of the children. The parents were satisfied. For Mr. Edgar, it wasn't enough. After all the conversations, he stayed at the school a little longer and talked to Ted personally. Returning home, he was sure that Ted was not the worst person in the village, and the parents showed no signs of cruelty. But the children were right about something too. As Mr. Edgar gathered a history on each resident in the Norman household, something strange was happening. And Iris noticed that Eric had also spent all night last night at a nightclub toward morning, and had come in drunk, and was still asleep. In the morning, when Norman was leaving for work, he asked him to tell him to have Eric at his office by lunchtime, and Iris decided to give this to Eric closer to lunchtime. When she went into his room on the 2nd floor, Eric was already out of bed. "Eric, good morning. Your dad told me to tell you to report to his office. He said it was serious," Iris said, and hurried back out of his room. But Eric blocked her way. "Wait, Iris, you don't have to run away from me. If anyone needs to talk, it's you and me," he said and stepped closer to her. It was that awful moment that Iris had been dreading all along. She has been walking like the tip of a needle since the beginning of her married life, so as not to provoke this spoiled guy. Iris felt perfectly well that the previous frank conversations and attempts to draw out of her some emotions and other things are all tricks of this guy. She realizes that Norman frankly pays more attention to her and spends little time with his son. But the son never assumes that his father is doing this willingly. He sees his stepmother as a major rival. And yes, Eric is in close contact with his mother. She's probably there to give him a lot of pointers on how to gain more space in his father's life. Even though she has no intention of returning to her beloved husband, sharing his privileges with another woman is particularly reluctant. No matter how hard Iris tries to maneuver. Now she's on the verge of a major trap. Eric, please don't cross the line. It will end badly for both of us. Iris tried to push him away from her and headed for the exit. You think I'm a little kid and don't notice anything. I've been seeing it all for a long time. The way you've been grooming me from all sides. I know your plans are devious. You want to compromise me in my father's eyes. That's why I'm maneuvering like a knife edge. But you don't have to fear any of this if you obey me. I won't tell your father about your open provocations. If you stay close to me, Eric insisted. What are you talking about? Eric, this is crazy. It's not my fault. Please stop acting like a capricious child. Iris was getting seriously worried. What kind of provocation are you talking about? I'm only trying to be on friendly terms with you. You and I have one person in common. He's close to you and me. What makes you think I have a personal affection for you? Iris raised her voice to you. Oh, come on. Your flashy outfits, your clever facial expressions, your smiles. I've been noticing it for a long time. Don't worry, don't worry. No one will ever find out. Eric continued to hold Iris' hand. After a short verbal altercation, Iris gathered all her strength into a fist, and she managed to break free from Eric's hands. She ran swiftly down the stairs until she took one wrong step and rolled headlong down the stairs. Eric heard a rumble and ran out following her down the stairs, and there lay the girl's frail body with blood running from her nose. Eric came running and picked her up and put her on the couch in the living room. He was terrified. He had no idea how to give a person help in cases like this. In a hurry, he ran into the kitchen, struggled to find the home first aid kit, but it contained only neatly folded bandages and nothing else. So Eric ran to the phone to call a doctor. But he realized that the doctor would not arrive here soon. It was almost an hour's drive from the city to the village. Eric decided to drive Iris to the hospital in his car. Why did I listen to Jeff? She was the one who fell down the stairs when she was scared of me. I wasn't really going to touch her. What kind of day is this? Thought Eric as he stepped on the gas of his car. Meanwhile, Iris's face had turned blue and tinged, and her body was hanging out of the back seat of the car like a bag of vegetables. When my father finds out, I can't avoid trouble. She might tell him why she ran up the stairs like that, too, right? Eric thought, and he felt even more uneasy. Meanwhile, Mr. Edgar's experiment continues. Several people come to him every day to tell him the worst behaviors and traits of their acquaintances, friends, or just fellow villagers. And Edgar was greatly surprised when a group of teenagers came to him. He hadn't expected such an active response. And today, he was even more surprised when a local cop came to see him. Turns out he knows who the worst person in this village is. Mr. Edgar, I know how to end crime in any community. It takes the good work of the so-called vice squad. In this case, it's the rector of the church. And instead of educating people, he collects money from the church and organizes religious festivals. Meanwhile, people often steal, beat each other up, damage each other's property, all because the churchmen are not doing their duties well enough. I don't think God will forgive him for that either. He himself says, "It is better to receive his punishment on earth than in heaven after death." I followed his idea of appointing him the worst inhabitant of this village, and let him do the dirtiest work in our village. It will be better for him than burning in hell after death, the cop said. Minister Edgar listened attentively and was struck by the depth of Kova's arguments. "You have been another revelation to me," Mr. Edgar said, and wrote down all of Kova's arguments in his notebook. Hearing such a serious accusation, Mr. Edgar decided a few days later to visit the churchman in person and talk to him. When he arrived, indeed, the church was empty, with no one present. "Father, why is there no one in the church on the day of service?" Minister Edgar asked. You know, these are the times. People have turned away from God. They have sold their souls to the devil and become dependent on the poor world, and they don't have the time or energy to go to church. A couple of years ago, one of the active ones even proposed to demolish this church and build a nightclub instead. God save us from such a thing, said the rector and crossed himself. Are you saying that people have forgotten about God? Mr. Edgar asked. That's exactly what I'm saying, but it's not their fault. God loves people infinitely. The proof of this love is the fact that he gave mankind the devil. What are you saying, Father? How does that make sense? How can the devil be a gift to human beings? Minister Edgar marveled. It's very simple. God gave the devil so that man could blame all his sins on him. It is a great opportunity to repent every time after committing a sin and every time to return to the abode of the Holy Father, said the abbot. Yes, you're right. There is something in it. Father, may I ask you a question? Mr. Edgar asked. I'm all ears. One of the important people in this village came to see me yesterday. If you know, I recently asked the people of this village to identify the worst person among them. Well, this important man thinks the worst person is you. Do you know why? Because you don't preach well enough, and people fall into sin through ignorance, said Mr. Edgar. A fellow cop pressed me. It was expected. We have an old conflict with this man. When I was a young man, there lived in our neighborhood an unprecedented beauty named Aria. I was young, handsome, educated, and rich, and a fellow cop at the time was starving. Both of us were attracted to this beautiful girl Aria, but the beautiful maiden chose me as her beau over the cop. He and I have been secret enemies ever since, so don't believe a word he says against me. It's because of youthful resentment and jealousy, the priest said. Ah, that's how it is. Interesting story. As far as I know, you are now living about a beautiful girl. Arise no, in your life. Mr. Edgar asked. Yes, that's right. My love turned out to be miserable. I didn't know who I was involved with. This beautiful girl turned out to be a companion. I found out about it very late. When I found out, I was already hopelessly fixed with her. I did everything I could to get her on the right path and stop sinning. But all was in vain. Suffering from heart itches, I acquired a host of diseases, body and mind. And in the end, she left me anyway and chose a licentious lifestyle. She still hosts rich gentlemen to this day. When I look at all this, I am weak and feeble. On days like this, I'm not even able to preach, the priest said. Father, do you think this is a beautiful area, good man or bad man? Mr. Edgar asked. How can a companion and a traitor be a good person? My whole life has gone down the drain because of her. Even now, after she is long gone from my life, she continues to live in the house across the street and do dishonor to me. Every time I look at her, I feel how far from holiness I am, the priest said, and his voice became agitated. Mr. Edgar had a very interesting picture in his mind. Mr. Edgar had a very interesting picture in his mind. The culprit was a certain grandmother who had led a vicious life many years ago in her distant youth. Now we should talk to this beautiful girl. Aria thought to himself, Mr. Edgar. A few days later, he visited this woman by name. He expected to see a beautiful girl, but he made a slight mistake in his introduction. The now beautiful girl had turned into a charismatic woman of mature age. From the looks of it, you couldn't tell that she was the source of the falling morals of this entire village. Aria greeted her guest in a very flirtatious manner. I heard that an honorable gentleman like you has settled in our village. I've been looking for a chance to get to know you. And this is such an unexpected, pleasant meeting, she said. I've never heard anything about you. I wonder why your fellow villagers didn't mention a fine woman like you. Mr. Edgar got in on the act. That's a good thing. I know a lot of them are jealous of me. They're afraid that all your attention will be on me. They only want to make the most of you on their own account. And how are you doing? How is your life going? Mr. Edgar asked, slowly looking around the interior of Ari's dwelling. Everything here spoke for itself. The fiery red walls hinted at passions. On the wall are elegant candle holders with candles blazing and a light fragrance. On the table are 2 sparkling glasses waiting for the clear wine that Apple always has in stock. Nearby lie some other sweets in beautiful wrappers. The woman herself is dressed in a long, cool robe, from behind which her seductively long legs brazenly peek out. I live my life as best I can. I've been judged for my lifestyle, of course, but I once made the decision not to resist my desires. That's why my paths went in different directions with the local church rector. He aspired to the sublime, and I epitomized the niche, Aria said and grinned. That's actually something I'd like to talk to you more about. Why do you want to talk about all this? Aria asked. That's a very good question. Are you the first person to ask that? The others chose to join in silently. Mr. Edgar said, You should know that I achieved everything many years ago, a long time ago. I have no need to think about my daily bread. All my worldly questions are solved for 3 generations ahead. When I had achieved all this, I asked myself, what do I want next? It was an excruciatingly difficult question. Usually, when people reach the top, there is a precipitous downward slide afterward. I knew this and feared it. After much agonizing reflection, I found the answers in my soul. I want to know human nature. From that moment on, and my already beautiful life was completely transformed. My wealth became less important. It became important for me to see something in each person that others don't have. My game of determining the best and the worst also comes from this. I wonder how you could have come straight to me. I would have told you right away what each person is like. All my life, I've yet to meet a man who can hear the truth about himself and not run away from it. I've never met anyone like that. I see you're already looking forward to that kind of knowledge, Aria said. You are quite right. People prefer to avoid themselves all the time. I've seen that time and time again, by putting them through various realistic tests. Following the rules of my game, I recently visited the church rector. He told me that you broke his heart and became a sacred wound in his life. Because of this, he cannot become truly holy and lead others to holiness. So the worst person in this village is you. Do you agree with that? Mr. Edgar asked. He was a little worried that the woman might be offended or angry, but Aria remained calm, just as cheerful. But finally Aria exclaimed and clapped her hands together. At last these people have begun to think, albeit with your help. They're finally thinking about who is truly good and who is truly bad. I hope this knowledge will help them to be truly happy. I always said that I was the worst person not only in this village, but in the whole world, Aria said and threw her hands to her sides. And Edgar was surprised. It was the first time he had ever seen a man speak of his unhappy plight with such joy and pride. He decided not to interrupt the lady. In fact, they all want to live like I do every morning, to make themselves beautiful, to put on the most beautiful clothes, to stay at home and fool around all day with breaks to eat good food, drink good wine, and meet only such people who come for real pleasures. They cannot even in their wildest dreams afford my daily life. I am at my lowest standards, and I am also paid generously for it. I have no worries except to look seductive and be in a good mood. That's my shortcoming. Did your church rector, when he was my life partner, truly hate me for it? I realized at that time that I did not have the strength and desire to strive for higher things as he did. Therefore, I did not cling to him and our life together. I let him go to his aspirations of his soul. If he is suffering now, it is because he would like to live his life as I do, but he did not find the strength for it. But he skillfully pretends to be the truest and most honest man in this village, Maria said. Is there anyone you can call the worst person in the village, other than yourself? Edgar decided to clarify, since this was the first time he had encountered such honesty. No, of course not. They're all good people. The other thing is me. I think I'm the worst person in the world because of the way I live my life. And the proof of that is the fact that I'm also proud of it and not pretending to be different from who I really am, Aria said. This interesting conversation went on for quite some time, and Edgar was quite surprised. He had met 1,000 different people in his life, but he had not met someone like this woman very often. On his way home, he met Freddie. He asked about the results of the experiment. "Secretary Edgar, how's your research coming along? We need to determine who will guard the chapel as soon as possible," he said. "I'm afraid your expectations will fail. The man who, by your standards, has turned out to be the worst of you is not fit to guard the chapel. She's a promiscuous woman. She's admitted it herself. But why not a teacher? Why not a priest? Why not a cop? Or even Norman?" Freddie asked in surprise. "Because they don't recognize themselves as such. And as long as a man thinks someone else is bad, he doesn't see the bad part of himself. That was my personal theory, and once again it was confirmed. And the results will be quite surprising to you," Mr. Edgar said. That was the end of his experiment. Now he knows everything about the inhabitants of this village, and the worst of them is the unremarkable Rasputin, a woman who lives on the outskirts of the village. But that's the crowd's version. Meanwhile, Iris has only been in hospital for 3 days. Norman was away on a business trip that day, and Iris decided not to say anything about what had happened so that her husband would not worry. But she didn't tell Eric anything about it. He was worried that his stepmother would get into trouble with his father. That's why all these 3 days did not leave the door of the hospital, taking care of stepmother. Through anger and hatred for her, the address was written out the day before Norman came home. She greeted her husband as if nothing had happened. Only Eric avoided seeing his father. He stayed out of his sight for days, and when he finally calmed down, he decided to continue his offensive toward his stepmother, to get rid of her. That afternoon, it was just the two of them at home again. Iris was busy with household chores. She now became very careful, does not enter the room where Eric is sitting, trying to stay on the first floor of the house, so that in case of danger to escape, someone knocked on the gate, and since she went to open it, in front of her stood Mr. Edgar. What an unexpected encounter. "Hello. If you remember, you and I are neighbors. My name is Mr. Edgar." "Yes, of course I remember. How could anyone forget you?" It came out of Iris' mouth. "If you'll allow me, I'd like to be your guest for a while." "Is that possible?" Mr. Edgar asked kindly. "Yes, of course. Come in. We are not at home, but his son and I are. By the way, Eric is also interested in your achievements and biography. And before I knew it, I was floating in front of this gentleman." At home, Mr. Edgar carefully examined the situation, periodically asked different questions, and I was surprised by the curiosity of this man. It was said about him that he had a cool disposition and a very unpredictable character. And now he was acting like one of the most typical people in this village. As for Eric's interest, Iris certainly embellished a bit. He was just as skeptical as his father that a legendary millionaire, a scandalously famous man, was their new neighbor. And when Eric learned that he had thought up some kind of experiment among the residents, and the winner guaranteed $0,000, he laughed it all, considering it for nonsense. Hearing the conversation in the living room, Eric decided to go downstairs and see who had come to see them. Seeing Mr. Edgar, Eric was a little displeased. "Eric Nelson, I've heard a lot about you, kid. How you doing? Why don't you come sit down and talk to us? Let's get to know each other like buddies." Edgar said hello. "What brings you here?" "I like to meet new people. I thought I'd drop by. I was told there were some wonderful people living here," Edgar said. "Well, they lied to you. I can tell you the truth. There are no great people here. My father lives here, who left his wife and 3 children and left home. His young wife lives here, a former model and a bit of an actress in life. She is, in fact, sitting in front of you. It's also where myself and Norman's no-good son live. A drunk, a spoiled bully, and a rebel. Which one of us is the most wonderful? So don't believe these people from our village," said Eric. "Do I like you, boy? That's what they told you about that too. Besides, most of your fellow villagers think you are the first candidate for the worst person in this village. Is it encouraging that you know the truth?" Mr. Edgar grinned. "In fact, you've been up to an idiotic thing. I know you actually have other goals in mind. At the very least, you want to turn all the residents against each other, and none of them are getting any of the $1 million. Now, I don't understand why you're doing this. If you were a woman, I'd be sympathetic. Only women are interested in such things," Eric said. Iris felt embarrassed that Eric was being so insolent toward such an important man. Edgar noticed it too. "Eric, you're free to think as you see fit, but my truth remains the truth. You'll see, someone will get $1 million from me, and I'll do it in front of everyone else, and someone else will have to watch and care for the old chapel all year. Could it be you? I'm ready to get started today, because I know how to solve this trifling problem once and for all. Tomorrow morning, these people will have the ruins of their chapel again." "Now that's the normal solution," Eric said. As much as Mr. Edgar tried to build a dialogue, he failed to connect with Eric. In all likelihood, the other residents are right. This Tarek is really unfixable, he thought, while he looked at Iris carefully and pondered Eric's words. The former model is a bit of an actress. Should be an interesting match for a little fling. Such a thought flashed through his mind, but he quickly switched to other conversations. It was a very ordinary family evening in Norman's household, and Iris was setting the table. Eric woke up. Recently, Norman wanted to talk to his son, but he promised that all the talk would be later, and Eric himself, out of habit, rushed to his friends, who had already planned entertainment for that night. But that was just an excuse, or tonight he had important business to attend to, and he did not intend to be distracted by entertainment. As Norman and Iris sat at the table, someone knocked on the door. Iris went to open the door. In front of her stood a middle-aged man of tall stature, stylishly dressed and smelling good. He was holding a bouquet of flowers and a large box with a ribbon. "Hello, darling. It's okay that I came to see you so unexpectedly." "Really, I called at night, and you didn't pick up," said the strange man. Then put his arm around Iris's waist and kissed him vigorously on the lips. "Excuse me, who are you?" asked Iris, when with difficulty managed to get out of the strange man's embrace. "Yes, stop pretending. Or is this some kind of game?" "Well, if you're getting me into the game, then I don't mind at all. I know how good you are in different roles," says the man, and again with a kiss, and Iris pushed him away with difficulty. "Men, I don't know you. Leave me alone and go away." She resented him. "I understand. Baby, you missed me. Is it okay for a sweet little thing like you to be cranky? You said so yourself on the phone." And then she got mad. She wanted to yell at the man, but he's unpredictable. His behavior clearly raises a lot of questions. The struggle went on for quite some time. The unfamiliar man would not admit to being a stranger. When Norman heard shouting and cursing, he also left the house. Turns out that's what this is all about. "Hello, Mr. Norman. And Iris, dear. Now I can see why you've been so angry. But I think it's time we told your husband the truth. How long can you and I hide?" says the man. "Norman, I don't know him. This is the first time I've seen this man. Please don't take his word for it. I have nothing with him." And Iris was almost crying. The more Iris explained herself, the more insolent the strange man behaved. He tried to keep her close, to hold her in his arms and press her against him. Norman saw that in the strange man's hands was a bouquet of Iris's favorite flowers and a box of red, just the way she likes it. "I don't understand you. What do you want in my house?" Norman was trying to figure out what was even going on. "The thing is, Iris and I love each other. I've been telling her to come clean for a long time, but she feels sorry for you. She thinks you'll figure it out and let her go. It's a good thing you saw for yourself. You shouldn't have any questions now," the strange man said. "No, none of this is true. This is the first time I've ever seen this man. screamed Iris, and she was almost hysterical. Norman stood there in complete incomprehension. I got it right. Iris is very afraid of you. I will leave you both to accept the new reality. Mr. Norman, I hope you don't see the woman you and I love. And with you, my dear, we'll call you in the next few days, said the stranger. The man left his gifts on the threshold and left leisurely. Turning the corner, the strange man took out his cell phone and dialed a number. Eric, buddy. Mission accomplished. Cool. You made all this up. You should have seen the look in your stepmom's eyes. I think she's gonna get a good kick out of your father. He was almost on edge, but as a well-mannered man, he could barely control himself, said the strange man. Rome, you have an underrated acting talent, and I've always believed in you. Thanks, buddy. Now come on, get a cab, and come to us. Is your reward waiting for you? Eric answered him. Old man Edgar called Freddie to his house again today. He hadn't been in the village for a long time. Now he decided to make up for lost time. It seems that you and I have some important business to attend to. Gather all the villagers. I have something to tell them, Edgar said. Hearing the new invitation, the villagers hurried back to Igor's house. Of course, the rich table and the exquisite treats were interesting to them. But even more interesting, who did Edgar decide to appoint as the worst person? Who is the one who will now carry the stigma of disgrace for an entire year? Every resident is sure that Edgar made his decision with exactly his advice in mind. When the whole village gathered and enjoyed the rich treats, with these, Mr. Edgar again asked for everyone's attention. If you remember, I was announcing a little experiment. I have gathered you here today to summarize the preliminary results. I have found that there are no sinless among you. Some of you have brought me lists of bad people. Some of you have come to me several times to convince me of your vision. Some of you I myself have personally gone to and tested how bad you are. Before I announce my decisions, I would like to ask you to express your guesses as to which of you will hold the title of the worst man in the village. Mr. Edgar added more intrigue. The guests glanced amongst themselves. Mr. Edgar looked at each of them, waiting for them to respond. But no one was in a hurry to offer an opinion. Come on in, maybe you have an opinion. Mr. Edgar turned to one of the most active participants in his experiment. Mr. Edgar, I have lived in this village for over 20 years, and I know everyone. Each of them has their own faults and virtues. I think each of my fellow villagers is well aware of their peculiarities. I believe that I have no right to interfere in such aspects of their lives, so I have nothing to add. Freddie said. Mr. Edgar nodded his head approvingly. He had conducted such experiments many times before. He knew for a fact that the participants would say different words depending on the situation. Freddie, for example, he was one of the most active participants who brought whole blacklists. And when all these people were gathered around the same table, he very politely recanted his words. Father, perhaps you have something to say. As the spiritual leader of this community, you know more than anyone. Do you think there is a fault in people or some of the unpleasant things that are happening in our community? Is it the work of the devil himself? Mr. Edgar turned to the priest. The priest was clearly not ready for a frank conversation at the table. Both good and bad come from the man himself. If he has a connection with the Lord God, then of course his thoughts will be pure. But if a person has not gone off the right path and has turned down the path of sin, then shame and dishonor will not escape him. Our Lord guaranteed that bad deeds will be hidden from his eyes. He promised to help spread the glory in every way possible until the person himself began to tell others about them. And our good deeds, following that, I would prefer to remain in the shadows, the priest said. The man once more confirmed Mr. Edgar's supposition. Before, why don't I see Mrs. Area among the guests? Asked Mr., remembering the beautiful mature woman leading a Rasputina lifestyle. The priest shuddered. He was worried that this millionaire for fun and laughter might tell his dramatic story with this Rasputina woman. He perked up, looking around. Freddie was also taken aback, but not confused. Minister Edgar, Aria's companion said she had other plans for tonight, but she promised that she would be sure to visit you at the first opportunity, Freddie said. After that, Freddie and the priest looked at each other. The priest nodded his head slightly. That meant that he would not be indebted. No one knew that the priest had set a condition for Aria not to attend this evening. Therefore, Freddie had not even informed her of Mr. Edgar's invitation. It was further proof of the man's hypocrisy, but she remained out of Mr. Edgar's sight. Instead, he abruptly changed the topic of conversation and turned his attention to the treats for the guests. The crowd, which had been curiously awaiting the name Shame, Nika was left bewildered. Apparently, it would have to wait a while longer for the name of that unfortunate man to be announced. The guests ate, drank, talked among themselves, amused themselves. From the outside, one would have thought that the villagers had no grievances against each other. As the evening drew to a close, one of the guests lost patience. "Minister Edgar, we've already guessed that you've invited us here for an important occasion. We know you're going to announce the name of the unfortunate one who was the worst of us. What is your choice? Who have you determined to be the best?" The man asked. "That's a good question. I was expecting it," Edgar said, and rose from his seat. He walked around the long table where all his neighbors were sitting. Every guest's gaze was fixed on him. "This is not the first time I have conducted an experiment here. As you know, I am a very wealthy man. I buy houses in different cities and towns. Among them, there are gated elite areas, and there are youth neighborhoods. They are located in different countries. Every time I settle in a new place, I organize some miracle contest. And you know, every time, the results are exactly the same. They're similar even in the smallest details. Is that interesting to you? Or should we stop here?" Mr. Edgar stopped and asked the guests. The guests expressed their willingness to listen to him further. They still had not given up hope of hearing the name of the worst man among them. Each one of them was sure that it was definitely not him. Meanwhile, Mr. Edgar continued his story. "So let it be known to all of you that he came to me with a list of the worst people, each and every one of you. And let it be known that each and every one of you has been repeatedly listed by others as the worst person. So there is no point in singling out a particular person. The point of my experiment is for you to realize that no one is a saint. You should also remember that there is always someone who is against you. I don't know what you should do with this knowledge, but you must always remember that from another's point of view, each of you stands on the same level," said Mr. Edgar. "And who will guard the chapel?" asked one of the guests. "That's for you to decide. How did you usually do it before?" Mr. Edgar asked. The guests became sad at first, and then even a little indignant. They came here for the spectacle, and to them, this man read them a moral. Mr. Edgar noticed the mood of the crowd. To lighten the mood, he asked his servants to bring a new batch of fine food and good wine. But the guests were no longer as lively as they had been at the beginning of the evening. When dessert was served, Mr. Edgar again asked for the audience's attention. "As you know, that was only the first part of the contest. There is still a second part. Now I am waiting for your feedback on the best person among you. And it's gonna be even more exciting than it was before. And remember, you only have 30 days. You may not nominate yourself as the best person. It has to be another person from this village, the one the others say is the best. In exactly 30 days, $1 million will come out of my hands right in front of your eyes. Are you ready?" Mr. Edgar turned to the audience. The guests looked at each other and thought again. What a challenge. This time Iris didn't attend the dinner party at Mr. Edgar's house. Those were not the easiest days of her life. After a strange man visited unexpectedly with a bouquet of flowers and gifts, Norman had many questions for his young wife. Barely escorting the annoying stranger out, they both returned to the house as soon as they crossed the threshold. Iris began to explain herself. "Norman, honestly, this is the first time I've seen this man. Do you really think I'm capable of treason? I don't know what that person wanted, but I certainly had nothing to do with it. Norman was silent for a long time in response. If he had been passionately watching the news on television before, now all his thoughts were occupied with something else. He did not respond to his wife's words, only stared thoughtfully at one point. "I suppose this man could have mixed up the address," said in a quiet voice as she tired of her husband's heavy silence. "It's possible to mix up an address, but damn it, he knows you. He brought your favorite peonies and the sweets you love. How do you explain that to me?" Norman finally gave it up. "I can't explain it. If you believe me, then help me understand this situation," said Iris. "Many people told me that my young wife might be cheating on me. I've dismissed such nonsense every time. But for some reason in my life, more and more facts hint at something bad," said Norman. "Who's telling you these things? Maybe these people have set such a trap for me. Why didn't you tell me that in the first place? And what facts are you talking about?" I've cheered up. "Never mind all that. In fact, I've been wanting to talk to you about my son for a long time. I overheard you and him talking the other day. You were talking about some kid. Then I overheard you talking about something very personal. What is that supposed to mean?" Norman exploded. "You heard a snippet of our conversation about Eric's friend's girlfriend. Your son Eric tells me all the time about the adventures of his friends. This time he relayed that his friend Jeffrey doesn't know what to do with his friend who got him pregnant. Jeffrey, who's a frequent visitor. That's who we were talking about. Do you have any more questions?" Iris shuddered with anger at her husband. "Why do you have so many private conversations with him anyway?" "I'm just trying to keep up a polite dialogue with him. He tells me stories. I share my opinions. You barely talk to him at all. You just give him commands. The rest of the time, you pay him off with money. Didn't you think the boy needed your support and company? Why should I support your relationship?" Yesterday, Iris finally came clean. "He's not a boy. He's 23 years old, and he's about to become the manager of my company. He's not a girl to be handled and listened to all the time. And I give him enough money to make him feel free. He needs to make connections. He needs to find his place in a certain circle where money is very important. Any other questions?" Now Norman exploded. "I was very offended. That you thought ill of me and my son. Do you even hear what you're accusing me of?" said Iris. "How am I supposed to think when a strange man comes straight to my house with gifts and kisses you on the lips? What else am I supposed to think?" The verbal altercation turned into a long family scandal. When the spouses were tired of yelling at each other, Norman decided to end the conversation. "Now, my dear, I'm giving you 3 days' time. During that time, you and I will not discuss or fight. During that time, you will think hard about how you and I are going to proceed. Either I have to stop getting facts that compromise you, or you have to make a choice," Norman said. "What do you mean, make a choice?" Iris asked. "It means you're going to choose either me or that strange man. So you're suggesting that I break up with you? We can break up because you don't believe what I say, and you believe whoever you want?" Iris asked, through tears. "And if you want that not to happen, then please give me a reasonable explanation for what's going on, not empty excuses. I'm done. And by the way, which one of us is sleeping in the living room? You or me?" said Norman last. "I," said Iris quietly. When Eric suddenly ran out of money at the restaurant, he was a little upset. The task turned out to be quite unfortunate. He was just about to take his friends to a nightclub after the restaurant. It would take a decent amount of money. So he turned to his friend Jeffrey. "How about you pay for everyone tonight? And tomorrow I'll pay you the full amount for the movie," Eric asked. "I'm sorry, buddy, but you know I don't have that kind of money. Besides, you invited everybody. You're going to have to do a lot of work yourself," my friend said. "Are you right? I don't have any money on me. We'll have to go home. Tell the girls we're going out for a while. Have them wait for us here, and you and I will go to my house," said Eric. After half an hour, Eric and Jeffrey sneaked into the house. They didn't know that Iris was lying down in the living room. Eric carefully opened his father's safe, while Jeffrey stood in the hallway. After a few moments, Jeffrey turned to his friend. Eric, I feel like I'm being drawn to sleep. Do you have any coffee? Let's have a quick drink. It's going to be a little hard to drive, said his friend. Now they moved into the kitchen. The kitchen and the living room are separated by a thin partition, so even whispers can be heard from here. When the coffee was ready, the boys sat down at the table and chatted among themselves in whispers. So is your father still hung up on that woman? Jeffrey asked. Unfortunately, yes, but it won't last long. Your advice didn't work. I came up with a cool way to do it myself. Last week, I approached Roma with a bouquet of flowers and gifts, so he could pretend to be my stepmom's lover. And that's when my dad was home, Eric said. Wow, you're a genius, man. So, what are the results? Your dad probably kicked her out the door, asked Jeffrey with a chuckle. What's the matter with her? She's still hanging around. I think she managed to convince my father of her sainthood. We'll have to do it again in the next few days. Then she won't stand a chance, Eric said. Then they stoked their coffee, turned off the light, and quietly closed the door behind them. Neither of them even realized that Iris was lying just behind the partition during this time in agonizing thoughts about her position in this family. After the boys left and Iris got up from her seat and lit a cigarette in the kitchen, she was calm now. A brilliant idea popped into her head, how to come out of this situation victorious. She decided to spring into action tomorrow. Mr. Edgar had taken a few days' leave to devote to his neighbors, who would come with suggestions for the best man among them. He remembers the last time he had to determine the worst. Several people came to him every day. He thought it would be the same this time. For the first 3 days, no one came. Then Mr. Edgar went to Freddie and asked if everyone was okay. Freddie wondered, why such questions? Has everyone forgotten that $1 million is at stake? I'm waiting for the candidates, said Mr. Edgar. Is that what you mean? I don't even know why no one comes. Freddie shrugged. Well, Freddie yourself, who would you say is the best person among your neighbors, relatives, friends, and fellow villagers? I'm sure you have some, Mr. Edgar said. I can't think of any. Think back. Maybe you've had some rough times in your life. Someone reached out to you. Someone gave you a kind word of encouragement. Just one person. Minister Edgar insisted. No, I don't remember anyone like that. Mr. Edgar, I grew up an orphan. I made it on my own. Built my own house, planted my own garden, bought my own van, started my own farm. Of course, there were many times I wished there was someone in my life who could solve all my problems, or not solve all the problems. But to come along and say, Freddie, you take a couple weeks off and enjoy yourself, and I'll do it for you. That's a big deal. No, that never happened, Freddie replied. Are you saying that all the people around you are indifferent? Mr. Edgar asked. Mr. Edgar, why do you like to ask such meticulous questions? Are people as they are, and is it unfair to divide them into good or bad? I mean, the same person can be different from one person to the next. Sometimes he can act like the ultimate scoundrel. Sometimes he can act like a wise man. Do you really think your stupid experiment is going to do anyone any good? I think you're just doing this nonsense because you've got nothing else to do. Freddie got mad. You mean Freddie? I don't really have anything else to do, so I study people. And the results of my experiment will not go to waste. I'm writing my book, and in it I'm describing all sorts of silly things in your language. You know what's interesting? You were the most active last time, weren't you? Why are you criticizing my experiments now? Mr. Edgar asked. I don't know. Maybe because it all annoys me. If your money bothers you, you could give it away for nothing. What do you care who or what anyone thinks of the man? Or are you just gonna bluff Freddie? No, he's not bluffing. There are already several people who have gotten their 1 million out of my hands. There's been a lot of press about it. You can look it up. But it's too bad you're not participating this time. Too bad, said Mr. Edgar, and headed leisurely to his home. Over the next few days, Mr. Edgar went around to all the neighbors with the same question. Who do you think is a good person? It was as if the neighbors were all in agreement. They refused to discuss the subject, and when Mr. Edgar asked them if their reluctance to talk might be due to shame for having slung mud at many of their acquaintances last time, some of them threw him out of their homes. Minister Edgar was used to such displays, so he took no offense. But not everything was so hopeless. After he was kicked out of the church by the minister, he was caught up on his way home by that nice and sweet neighbor Iris. "Mr. Edgar, if you're not in a hurry, listen to me. Is there someone I can tell you about?" said he as he ran after him. "Well, that's interesting. Come on, let's go home," said Mr. Edgar, and they came to his well-maintained yard where there were wooden gazebos, and Iris was the first to speak. "I am aware that you have announced the second part of your experiment. Is that correct? Do you have someone to praise?" asked the old man. "Yes, I have someone to praise. The best man in our village is called Eric. He is my husband's son. True, Eric is a bit spoiled, but he has a pure soul and pure thoughts. Choose him as the winner. You won't regret it," Iris said. "I suppose so. And how can you justify such a flattering characterization of your stepson?" Mr. Edgar asked. And then Iris wondered. All she remembered about her stepson was his dirty molestations, provocations, threats, and even his latest setup with a strange man. She doesn't remember anything else he did. But now we have to answer the old man's question somehow. "You know, I don't really have anything to back that up. I just don't think Eric's personality is quite there yet. He's got his best stuff dormant inside of him. And if you give him a little push, everything will fall into place. My stepson will bring out his best," Iris said. "Well, have I written down your feedback? Let us now wait until the end of the appointed time," replied Mr. Edgar lastly. After this conversation, Iris had a nice chat with the millionaire for some more time and then went back home. True, neither of them guessed that their conversation had been inadvertently overheard by someone in the immediate neighborhood. The news that the agitated son of the unloved Norman was claiming to be the best man quickly spread among the residents. Victor, the first to hear about it, was Freddie. He couldn't stand Norman's son. When he imagined that this pompous guy would be called the best, he lost his temper. He wanted to go to Norman's house right now and tell him what the others thought of him. But before that, he decided to catch Eric in something unflattering, so that everyone else would be convinced of the unfairness of Edgar's decision. He began to prepare his intrigues. Meanwhile, the teenagers, the youth of the village, had also learned the news. The young lady's eyes lit up, and the young men nodded approvingly. As the youths sat on a bench along the road, Eric was just about to go to another evening of entertainment. "Hey, Eric, you're awesome. Way to go," shouted one of them as he drove by. Eric didn't pay any attention to this remark, but just nodded his head in gratitude. A couple more days later, Eric was strolling down the main street of Istok. His path crossed with a local priest who was in a hurry to get to church. The priest remembered that this guy was a contender to be the best and decided to encourage him. "Eric, you're doing great. Your father must be proud of you. You're such a nice guy," he said as he walked by. Eric nodded his head, but in the back of his mind he wondered a little what had happened to his neighbors. Usually, they didn't even say hello. And here the compliments of admiration one after another. The cop who surprised him the most was the one who came running in from a distance and shook his hand. "Eric, I always believed in you. You're a good man. We need people like you in our society. You'll see, soon the young people will start to follow your example. See if their morals improved," said the cop. Eric was definitely in a reverie now. It was as if the neighbors and the villagers were in cahoots. But he was quite pleased with this attitude. All day long he walked in high spirits. And the next day, as he walked down the street, without noticing it, he began to greet everyone first. And old Betty even invited him into her house and treated him to pies, which she only drank. When Iris called her friend, she was reading a sad novel and periodically sighed heavily. The misunderstanding in her relationship with Norman had taken a great toll on her. Of course, he didn't bring up the breakup again, but a cold wall had formed between them. Her friend had decided to support her today. "Iris, but how are you still sad there, or everything is getting better?" asked her friend Catherine. "It seems to have gotten better, but it's not the same. I think Norman is harboring doubts in his soul. I do not know how to influence it, so I am sad. To be honest, I'm tormented between two men," she sighed. "What's the matter with Eric? He still oppresses you, and you can't tell his father anything so as not to ruin their relationship?" Catherine asked. "Speaking of Eric, things are about to change. Remember, I told you that we have a new neighbor, a weirdo, a millionaire. He promised $1 million to whoever was chosen to be the best man in the village. I went to him and told him that Eric was the best man." Iris grinned. "What do you mean he's the best man when he's a drunk and a bully? And anyway, what did he do to deserve such happiness as a free $1 million? Catherine wondered. "It's very simple. If he's lucky, Eric will get this money, and the first thing he will do is to get away from his father. He will want to buy a house and live separately, and then he will want to organize his business separately from his father. The business is fine. He's not really into it anyway. He's agreeing to inherit it purely for the money," Iris said. "Well, if that's the case, of course. Don't you have a chance of getting that $1 million yourself?" Catherine asked. "I don't think so. To get it, I'd have to have someone else give me that kind of feedback, and no one here knows me. The ones who do know me quietly hate me. I don't know why, but I could certainly do something else if I wanted to," Iris said. The conversation went on for a long time, but the subject of money was never mentioned again. The last few days had been very meaningful for Eric. Active attention and recognition at every turn. It had changed his outlook on life and people dramatically. In just a few days, he had noticed how many interesting and friendly people there were among these neighbors. He even began to feel shy deep down. That before he had always considered them petty people and disdained them. Now Eric could calmly linger on the street for a conversation with another neighbor. He could safely go to any of them in the house, sit at the same table. He liked that very much. Suddenly, Eric felt that he also wanted to do something nice for these people. The first such person was an old lady-to-be. Eric specially set aside a free day to fix the old lady's old furniture. True, he had never done such a thing before. But the old lady herself helped him with hints, and when the business was over, she treated him to her delicious pie again. At parting, the old woman patted the boy on the shoulder and blessed him with good luck. Eric experienced such pleasant feelings for the first time in his life. A couple of days later, he wanted to feel this state again. He started looking for someone to help him with some things. A priest came to mind. When Eric arrived at the church, he was tidying up the yard. Eric asked him to sit on a bench while he hauled all the leather hay to the back of the church. When the job was done, the priest blessed him for good luck too. Then he invited the boys into the cellar, where they drank simple herbal tea. The priest told Eric different parables that made the guy think even more. Freud. Meanwhile, every day he asked Mr. Edgar about the results of the experiment. He was looking for a way to foil Iris's plans to keep Eric from becoming the best man in Freddy's village. 1,000 times I regretted that I had written so many complaints about almost every one of my neighbors in the first phase. I should have left at least one alone. Now that one could have been listed as the best, if that one had won $1 million from the old man, it would be split in half. Brady was doubly angry at his stupidity, and when he found out that the second candidate never showed up, with only a few days to go before the end of the experiment, he got into everything. Constant drinking. And today she decided to try once again to return the former warm attitude of her husband. She cooked his favorite dish, put on her best dresses, organized a romantic setting, and called her husband. "Darling, so much has happened between us lately. I'm asking you to try to come home early tonight. I want us to have a romantic dinner," she said. "I can't promise you anything as I have important things planned for today. I'll probably be late." Dryly, Norman replied. The conversation ended very quickly. Norman hung up the phone and thought, since his wife was trying to win back his favor, she must have something to be ashamed of. The detectives, of course, found nothing suspicious in Iris's lifestyle, but still she was only to blame for allowing a situation in which he had to question her fidelity. Norman thought his deception about important business for the evening was correct, but in fact he had no important business to attend to. He had purposely decided not to have dinner together, so that Iris would be tormented as long as possible, and henceforth would not even think of breaking relations with him. Let this be a lesson to her for a long time, Norman thought. Meanwhile, the day of announcing the winners of Edgar's experiment was approaching. Everyone awaits this day with curiosity. Traditionally, on this day, Edgar would set a lavish table, serving the best wines and the most exquisite dishes. His neighbors didn't doubt it until they saw the sign on Edgar's gate and the sale of his house. Did our neighbor decide to move out? He didn't like it here. Where's he gonna move to? What's gonna happen to his experiment? Was it really a hoax? Were the neighbors whispering amongst themselves? Oh no, I've never cheated anyone in my life. It'll be just as I promised you, Mr. Edgar himself said. About that. Indeed, on the appointed day, everyone showed up except the Norman family. Eric was busy that day with his charity projects he had recently launched. Norman decided to intentionally stay late at work, and Iris waited faithfully for him. The guests feasted on gourmet food, drank good wine, and marveled at Eric for not coming to such an important event for him. In the middle of the evening, Mr. Edgar asked for the audience's attention. You all know the occasion for which we are gathered here. I don't want to keep you waiting. I've already sold this house to a good man. He'll be moving in any day now. And I'm leaving your pleasant company, for my experiment has achieved its purpose. I know who is the best man among you, said Mr. Edgar, and started walking around the table again. Eric, of course. Eric, this has long been known. But the lad is worthy. He's changed in a good way. Ever since the rumors started, the guests have been whispering about it. And that person is Mrs. Iris. It's a pity she didn't come. But I'll be sure to stop by before I leave and give her the money, Mr. Edgar said, and asked one of his bodyguards to show him the suitcase with the money. There was indeed real money in it, neatly stacked in a row. The guests were in such deep surprise, as they knew nothing about this woman. And this woman did not know that she had been chosen as the winner of this contest. 2 days later, early in the morning, Norman found a tiny note on the kitchen table from his wife, saying that she was leaving for Mr. Edgar and divorcing him.
Subscribe and click the bell.
There was no way they were going to meet. There was no chance. Their lives were like planets orbiting far apart in different orbits. Alex, a law student who had nothing to do at an expensive fashionable resort, was brought here by illness. Last winter he was depressed, and it came out of the blue. Yes, he studied for days and nights, sitting at the textbooks. Yes, he was in practice, where he saw such scum of the earth that God forbid he should meet them on a narrow path. And then one day he ran out of energy all at once. He lay with his back turned to the wall and stupidly looked at the geometric patterns of the carpet. He didn't want to eat, study, or even live. His mother and father were terribly worried. Alex was their only late son, a fictionally gentle, intelligent people. They never pressured the boy. If he was forbidden something, he understood perfectly well why. And all that could be allowed to him, allowed to get a dog, to bring home friends with a sleepover, to go with the class on a camping trip. He never heard from his father and mother no. It was the same with his choice of profession. Alex's mom worked as a people's assessor for a while. They're called nodding fields because they never challenge a judge's opinion or decision. But Mom had a girlhood crush on the judge, an attractive blue-eyed woman of about 45 years old. Mom admired people who, despite a difficult life, retain optimism and a cheerful disposition. Judge Nancy had been divorced a long time ago and was raising a deaf-mute daughter. Her husband left just because of the birth of such a sick daughter. Also a member of their family was a huge Maine Coon cat. Once there was a newspaper with a program on TV, and the cat took this paper as a special kind of invitation, meaning you can come here. The program was removed a long time ago, but we couldn't eradicate the cat's bad habit. They never turned on the TV. Nancy Helen's daughter lived in a special boarding school. She came home on weekends. Her mother was not going to marry anymore and gave all her strength to her work. In the first place, because she sincerely loved her work, and in the second place, she saved most of her earnings. She wanted to take Lena abroad for treatment. Surgery plus rehabilitation. Every day Nancy had to judge people who stole something or didn't share something or beat up or even killed. Most of all, she did not like the cases concerning the division of property, when people who had previously considered themselves relatives and were going to live together for the whole century began to fight over some closet or gold jewelry, and attacked each other with such fury that the civil case right there in the courtroom and threatened to turn into criminal. One time Alex went to pick up his mom too early. He had to wait for her. A young man named Parker was on trial. He had just been released from the zone and returned to his mistress Betty and was just beginning, so to speak, to taste freedom. In the evening they quarreled and Parker stabbed Betty. The ambulance came. Betty was drunk and didn't want to go to the hospital. They could barely convince her to get stitches. She wanted to stay with her example, who didn't understand why he'd taken up the knife. In the courtroom, they told each other they loved each other. "Betty, I'm sorry, there's no one I care about more. Parker told you. I'm going to sit down again, aren't you? I'll be waiting for you." Betty pressed his hands to his chest. This was a side of life Alex didn't know, had never encountered. Parker got 2 years and 10 months. And Betty was in the hallway excitedly discussing with her sister what to send him in first gear. Nancy felt sorry for him, Mom said as she and Alex drove home. She gave him the shortest sentence possible. He had already been convicted once, but his girlfriend was almost on her knees, assuring him that she held no grudge against him. Alex seemed to be thinking about something of his own. But isn't that when he started reading different literature? Not like before. If before he was interested in adventures, now they were replaced by detectives, books about the elusive, criminals, bloody maniacs, their kidnapper, and domestic violence. In Alex's senior year of high school, he told his parents he wanted to become an investigator. Mom was scared. "It's dangerous. Can't you choose some more peaceful profession?" Dad objected. "Alex is not likely to go into a dangerous line of work. I think he'll work in our small town, and soon all romance will be dispelled. He'll have to investigate a case like the one where a homeless man broke into an apartment and stole a laptop to drink it away. So I'd like to know, wouldn't a chore like this turn him away from the legal profession?" Alex wasn't in the mood to open up. So he briefly said, "We'll just have to wait and see." And during the years of study, he really had to see a lot of things that were too cruel, rough, ruthless. Practice was coming to an end, and again lectures were replaced by seminars. And at home he had to study reports, prepare term papers, and then look at the subject of his diploma. I studied every day until late at night. And finally, from the accumulated fatigue, and there was that very nervous breakdown. He became depressed. Parents were worried God knows where the money came from and bought him a trip to an expensive sanatorium by the sea. Alex didn't even want to go. What difference, where he will lie for hours in a fetal position in a city apartment on the 8th floor or in a local room, 100 meters from the sea. But suddenly the change of place did him good. In the sanatorium, the doctor began to treat him the old-fashioned way. He did not prescribe expensive procedures for the young man. Different spa healing climates, sea bathing, long walks, and drinks with soothing concoctions that were given at the bar had to do the trick. And after a few days, Alex felt that the air here was really healing, and he began to fall asleep easily in the evening. Sleeping soundly at night, he stopped having nightmares, and early in the morning he was greeted by the sea, clear as a tear, which washed away all the negativity and got rid of heavy thoughts for breakfast. Alex came with a wolfish appetite from metal, even milk porridge, which he did not like before. At the table, his neighbors were a father with a small daughter and a middle-aged woman. The little girl had a pretty face. Her hair was twisted into 2 thick pigtails. She chattered amusingly, and somehow it so happened that if the little girl was given peaches or cakes, everyone at the table was happy to give them to the little girl. Her daddy Benjamin smiled, embarrassed and grateful. The middle-aged woman's name was Helen. She was unusually silent. It was clear that she was a wealthy woman. What was the jewelry alone? In the ring and hid a large diamond earrings with the same gemstones attracted admiring glances. Helen's short-cropped hair was kept small, which she dressed simply, but not a single thing looked cheap. And also the open things that women in the South love so much. Helen wore no loincloths, short skirts, over t-shirts. She always threw on a long-sleeved shirt or jacket. Helen probably did this then to hide her painful thinness. She seemed not just slim, but truly emaciated. Alex thought she must be on some fancy diet. Sometimes Helen sat down at the table, drank only a glass of tea and left immediately. Sometimes, without any appetite, she would pick at the second course with a spoon and leave the plate. It was still rare when I managed to meet her gaze. If the neighbors at the table were talking to her, Helen answered, looking somewhere past, and her answers were always complicated and her voice quiet, as if she was afraid to say an extra word. Alex never met her either on the beach or on excursions, and they were organized almost every day in the sanatorium. You could see Helen only on the farthest paths, and that's not immediately noticeable, sitting on a bench somewhere, face hidden by a wide-brimmed hat, enjoying the solitude. Alex didn't really care. He was glad that he was starting to come to life himself. There was an interest in life. For the first time in many months, he began to make some plans. Periodically, all vacationers in the sanatorium had to visit the doctor to check how the treatment was going. What was the result? Alex waited for his turn. Sitting in the corridor at the doctor was Helen. The door was slightly open, and Alex heard her voice, characteristic, slightly stated, "To great regret, we were not able to help you. Isn't that right?" Sebastian asked the woman softly. "Well, probably, if I hadn't come to you, I would have been worse off." Helen tried to answer delicately. "You haven't put on weight." "Not a bit." "Blood pressure's still spiking," Sebastian listed. "And the psychologist says your anxiety level hasn't gotten any lower." "That's right." Silence. Alex imagined Helen nodded. "That's right," Sebastian summarized. "Until it's removed. The root cause you won't recover. I would recommend that you see a psychiatrist when you arrive. Apparently chemistry should already be involved here. Have him find some medication." No, Alex has never heard Helen speak so loudly and with so much excitement. "It's impossible for me. Even then, I proved with great difficulty that I'm not mentally ill." That's the only reason he got jail time. After all, he presented the case so that I made up everything with an unstable person psycho and make hysterics. Jealous of everything and everyone. Plus a vivid imagination. And it's a done deal. But you didn't do the beating yourself. Sebastian was still talking softly. "It's still a basic fact. Didn't I tell you? He somehow convinced my friends, ex-girlfriends, to testify that I've been weird since I was young, that I can cut myself and stuff like that." Okay, apparently the doctor preferred not to go into all that. There was silence. Sebastian must have been writing. "Get it at the nearest drugstore. These are sleeping pills. They're a prescription drug. And for the last few days you'll be here, get some sleep, and don't think about anything. I strongly advise you to go home. Let not psychiatrist, let psychotherapist, let psychotherapist. No one will put you on the register. But as you do not realize, you will not be able to live fully, will not be able to enjoy life, if you do not work on this problem. How much life is left in there, doctor?" Helen abruptly pushed back her chair. A couple of moments later, the door opened, and without looking at Alex, the woman walked quickly down the corridor. For some reason, all day long the young man couldn't forget about this conversation. He waited for dinner to see Helen in the dining room. Usually she was always a little late. They served very pretty cakes for dessert, baskets with cream and fruit. Alex automatically handed his to Ninotchka, while he looked out the door every now and then. But Helen never appeared. The next day Alex, as usual, went to the beach. Early in the morning he liked those hours, when there was still no one here. But who among the vacationers would really think of getting up at 5, Only a few fishermen could be found on the shore. But suddenly he saw Helen. The woman was sitting on a chaise lounge under the awning, although the sun had just descended. But one could see Helen. But you could see Helen, and here wanted to remain as inconspicuous as possible. She was wearing a denim fiber skirt, long to her heels, and some kind of stretchy sweater that Helen was tangled in. She sat with her arms around her knees and stared in front of her. Alex didn't want to disturb her and was about to discreetly retreat, but then she looked at him. They nodded to each other. "Good morning, can't sleep," he said. Because he had to say something. As it turns out, even the pills don't work for me. Helen grinned. Alex didn't expect her to answer. She hadn't told anything about herself until now. "And I was tired of studying," he said. "Have a seat on the next slogan. Once I decided to give myself a break. That made it easier. Maybe you should also not think about unpleasant things." As Helen looked him straight in the eyes. "Can you do that? Teach me. How do I do that?" Suddenly tears came to her eyes. Helen bit her lip and stared at the sea. He could think of nothing but the trivial. But there are no unsolvable problems in the world. "Only if someone died, I died," Helen said. Isn't it obvious? Helen grew up with a stepmother, and once wanted more than anything to have her own home and her own family. Though everyone around her admired her father, her stepmother, and all three of Helen's children, and her two free, younger brothers. Her father was a scientist, a university lecturer, soft in family life, and a professor who was passionate about science to the point of madness. He forgot about food and sleep. If it was about his favorite science, his first wife died a few days after the birth of Helen. On the face of it was not so rare reason, a medical oversight. Later, someone changed all the records. I didn't punish anyone for that story. No one was suspended. And the grief-stricken professor never tried to get justice. Perhaps he wanted to raise his daughter on his own and never marry again. But after a few years, he met a young woman, whom he sincerely admired, as he did. Maria was in love with science, which means that she lived a spiritual life in words, and everything material was of secondary importance to her. The professor very quickly proposed to her, and Maria was not afraid to marry a man with a child. 2 years later, she gave birth to twins and decided that she had had enough of children, although the professor had hired her an assistant from the beginning. Still, the small children demanded too much attention. The housekeeper took over the household, cooking, washing, cleaning. But her mother didn't trust her to raise the boys. Maria wanted to raise her sons in her own image. Spiritual came first. One couldn't put too much value on things. Not even the fact that the couple's child saw toys as living things. No discount was made. A few times a year, the mother would pack plush animals, cars, and the like into a large cardboard box and give it to a woman she knew. A poor woman with many children. And God forbid that the boys would regret something, of course. In exchange for the given toys were bought new dressed boys were also not worse than their peers. But since they were little, they knew not to dream about things. Fashionable backpack or in one ship, which itself will swim in the bathtub, grinds the water with a propeller. But about this or that book, or that recovered father, who had a heart condition, you can dream quite well. With the boys, this issue passed. They obeyed their mother, at least for the time being. But Maria, from the very beginning, tried to apply this method of upbringing and stepdaughter. However, she was disappointed. Helen did not accept the punishments. She cried. One time, she even had a nervous attack. Her father promised Helen for her birthday the same lush princess dress that the girls' friends had. Most likely, the professor didn't understand what it was all about at all. But he had the pleasure of going with Helen to the store and pleasing her with a grade. Helen was so excited about the gift, made on the eve of her birthday, that she put on the dress, not wanting to take it off. When she was nevertheless persuaded to change into a nightgown before going to bed, her stepmother took the dress and hung it up in the closet in the room, saying she would allow the outfit to be worn on holidays. Helen, from whose hands the coveted article had been snatched, burst into tears so that her hands began to tremble. And the next day she had a fever. And instead of a holiday with a cake and candles and balloons, instead of fun with her friends, Helen lay in bed in semi-oblivion. Then the father and stepmother had a long talk behind closed doors, and the stepmother backed off from raising her stepdaughter. She forbade Helen practically nothing else. The girl simply ceased to exist for her. If Helen addressed her with any question, Maria answered to ask her father. The professor was so busy, so far from real life, that very soon the girl had to become independent. Sometimes she asked her father about her own mother. Tears invariably came to the professor's eyes. Katya was so sweet, cheerful, with an easy character, that with her death all joy left the house. Apparently, Helen had taken after her mother in many ways. She tried to arrange for two factions to form in the house. After all, Maria has sons. The girl reasoned, so let her be with Benjamin and Tony, the three of them, and they will not be bored. And Daddy's mine. Otherwise, it's not fair. They're together, and I'm alone. But the stepmother was quick to put an end to her daughter's claim to her father's attention. She believed that no one can be closer to her husband than herself. They work together, they have common interests. And Helen is growing up. And soon she will have her own life and her own spouse. Thus, the girl's relatives were replaced by her friends. She often stayed with them for days at a time. Her friends' parents didn't mind. No matter what, Helen was well, raised in a friendly manner, always tried to help with the housework. Sometimes someone would say, "I wish I had a daughter like that." Helen would only flinch. Apparently, deep down, it was weighing on her. The fact that, unlike her peers, she did not have a normal family, and she really wanted to have one. No one came to Helen's graduation. The professor was very busy. There was some important meeting of the scientific department. He asked his wife to go to the school, but at least for the solemn part of the awarding of certificates. But Maria made a distant sign. "I haven't been involved in Helen's education for a long time. I don't want to be a hypocrite, participating in this celebration." The professor only shrugged his shoulders and smiled guiltily at his daughter. "I apologized for the way things turned out." However, Helen was already hardened by life, and she only grinned. She did not expect anything else. However, the behavior of her father she still assessed as a betrayal and chose a university for herself in another city. Her father rented her an apartment. Here you have to give justice. The stepmother never interfered if the father spent money on his daughter. "I know for myself in the hostel, and it is difficult to study well," said the professor. "There you stay up late, you bring friends. And if you are going to study seriously, you need a quiet and working environment." He went with his daughter, visited her new apartment, gave a generous sum of money for Helen to buy everything she needed. But when the girl became a student, her behavior changed. It's as if she got to all sorts of entertainment. Now she often lingered in nightclubs, carefree fun with new friends. They could drink so much that they could hardly tell the cab driver their home address. And boys for the evening to pick up and afford any other craziness. And Helen dressed in ways she never would have thought possible. She used to wear bright, flashy things. She used to leave her hair loose. She was naturally very good-looking, and she was never without male attention. Another thing is that now she remained as kind and trusting as she had always been. She was introduced to Leo by a classmate. Julia had a boyfriend, and he had a friend. Why not sit together with the same company? They were already settled at a table in a cafe. The friend's boyfriend was running late. But when he showed up, Julia's face stretched. She must have thought she blundered. Finished with the wrong guy. Suddenly he looked like he'd stepped out of the pages of a men's fashion magazine. No, in this case it didn't matter what he was wearing, but that hard face. The sneer. Such bright eyes and black eyebrows in the span of a young girl is covered with pictures of such a Superman. His bedroom. It was strange that Leo still didn't have a girlfriend. He willingly took on the role of Helen's beau. For the rest of the evening, he took care of her, pouring her wine, laughing at her jokes. And when the party was over, he walked her home. Perhaps it could have been limited to a few kisses goodbye. But Helen saw no reason why not. Why shouldn't they end a wonderful evening? On an equally marvelous night, she took her new pal by the hand and carried him back to her house. And indeed, the night was so intoxicating that in the morning both didn't want to part. That was where it all began. The romance spun up most impetuously, and 2 weeks did not pass. Leo confessed his love to Helen and asked her to marry him. She was amazed at such a hasty decision, especially since, having looked at her family, she did not want to get a stamp in her passport as soon as possible. Girlfriends met the news differently. Someone who enthusiastically forbade and began to ask for a wedding, preferably as a witness. Someone who has already seen the handsome Leo and frankly invited. And Sophia's closest friend only shook her head. Sophia was not a prude at all. She was happy to open up at the same parties that Helen was happy to pick up guys for one night. So Helen was all the more surprised. "What do you like?" she asked. "I'm not getting married yet, but you should have seen how beautifully he proposed to me. All honorable." On her knees, with a bouquet of flowers and a stunning gilt diamond ring, Helen showed her hand with a dainty ring. "I said I would think about it." With poorly concealed pride, she said, "And at any rate, as long as I wear the ring, I will be faithful to it." And what did he interrogate Sophia about? It seemed to me that he was very upset that I had not consented. Helen confessed at once. I think he imagined that I would turn, throw myself on his neck, and confess my eternal love in return. Sophia shook her head again. "I haven't had any experience of my own family life, of course," she said. "But I don't often see guys of that age getting married so quickly. So far, I've only seen a few cases of young men proposing marriage so quickly. And you know who they were talking about? Alcohol. And both of them were already incorrigible. Or, as they say, incurable. And they'd already tried marriage, but their wives couldn't take it for long." "You mean he drinks?" Helen laughed. "I'm gonna disappoint you, but I'm a leader in this business. You know I sometimes can't resist an extra cocktail, and he doesn't even guzzle. He's driving. What do you know about him?" Sophia kept up. "Well, his father left the family early. His mother raised him, but she was difficult. She drove men around and paid little attention to her son. Maybe that's what we have in common. Neither he nor I had a normal family. Maybe," Sophia agreed thoughtfully. "But if I were to advise you to look for a husband, it would be among those guys who had a normal, good family, where the father was used to taking care of the mother, whose son saw that." And I lazily pitied with unexpected seriousness, said Helen. He, like me, wanted warmth at home, and his mother gave all her warmth to strange men. He hoped that she would at least give birth to another child, and he would have a brother or sister to take care of. But no. He grew up a lonely orphan with a living mother. "But you're not going to run off and marry him right now, are you?" "No, of course not." Helen sounded concerned. "I've already messed up my studies with these affairs. I have debts for the last session. There's no way I can retake it, and I have to do it. It would be a big blow to my father if I suddenly dropped out of the institute. He's the one who pays my rent and gives me money to live on." "Yes," Sophia agreed. "So far you've had it easy. But if you lose your allowance, you'll have to work part-time like many other students." Unfortunately, things took a turn for the worst for Helen, when she once again came to retake the course. The teacher, who already disliked her, tried to do everything to stump the girl. He asked unexpected questions, demanded knowledge of additional material. Helen had spent several sleepless nights preparing for the exam, and now she had everything mixed up in her head. She ended up getting another D. In the study section, she was told that, in general, if she did not want to be expelled, she had two options: or take a leave of absence for whatever reason or switch to a paid department. The girl was not satisfied with both options, but the second was worse than the first. Studying was expensive. She could not take this load on her father. It remained to take an academic classmate, whose mother was a gynecologist, asked her to make a fake pregnancy certificate. Helen was given a sabbatical leave. The girl decided to get a job in a cafe, save up some money. And if she couldn't recover next year, she'd pay for her own tuition. But Leo, when he found out what had happened, insisted on marriage with redoubled force. "You won't be dependent on your father," he urged. "I earn enough. If you want to, you'll study further. Do you want to?" "No. Don't you like the prospect of being your own boss?" Helen resisted for a while. She did get a job as a waitress in a small restaurant, but she didn't last long. First, she was snapped at by a customer who thought Helen was too clumsy and sloppy. Then her companions accused her of cheating on her tips. In this restaurant, it was customary to deposit tips in a common pot and then to distribute them. And most of it went to those who had worked here for a long time. The newcomers, on the other hand, got the crumbs. This unwritten rule seemed so unfair to Helen that she actually arranged for some of the money that visitors gave her. In short, the girl was out on the street. And that's when she went to the registry office with Leo. They took the application, and the glowing groom asked her what kind of wedding she wanted. Something modest? Helen asked, "You don't have to spend a lot of money on all this tinsel. I'm fine if we get a table somewhere." "Oh, that's fine." Leo seems to be okay with that. "I wouldn't want to be the lead in a play where everyone's staring at you." Helen laughed at you. "You're the one who's handsome like a movie star." "Not me. I'll be invited. By the way, I haven't been to your house yet. You haven't met my family. My relatives live on the other side of the country and are unlikely to come to the wedding. I'd love to show you the house next weekend. Only now it seems too small. I never thought about it before. But now that I've met you, I want a big, very big family." Helen only laughed. No, she didn't mind children. But first, he'd have to get his degree. The day before the wedding, he gave her a present. They were to go on a wedding trip, but it was supposed to be special, just like he was special. He rented a cottage by a lake in one of the northern regions, but you probably can't swim there. Yes? Helen mumbled confusedly. She had assumed that they would go somewhere after the wedding. But she imagined that it would be the south, maybe Turkey or one of the European countries. Even the Krasnodar region. Sea, sun, fruit. A room in a nice hotel. They would get up at dawn and walk along the beach, holding hands. But Leo even grumbled. "You can't find privacy there in season with so many people. The beaches are jammed with excursion crowds, and I want you and me to be alone." And after a few days, Helen was convinced that her husband was right. Instead, he chose a wonderful retreat and a cottage in the woods, surrounded by huge, picturesque fir trees. How wonderful the pine needles smelled. It took a few minutes to walk along the wooden planking to the lake and sit on the bridges and admire the view. The water in the lake was the clearest and not so cold. They enjoyed swimming several times a day. The cottage was small, but Helen fell in love with it. 2 bedrooms, the second one was obviously unnecessary. A cozy kitchen finished in wood and a living room with a window and a fireplace. The ceiling-high refrigerator was filled with groceries and newlyweds. There was no need to drive to the nearest town, although it was a quarter of an hour at most by car. Helen had never had such a good time. They would actually get up at dawn, have coffee on the terrace, and then the whole day belonged to them. One could walk along forest paths, discovering new picturesque corners. You can splash as much as you like in the clear, clean water. On rainy days, one could read by the fireplace, listening to the sound of the rain. And that night they spent under the open sky, sheltered by a single plate, with the same old starry river flowing over their heads. Helen had forgotten to bring her birth control pills. Going through the small medicine cabinet, she discovered they were gone, although she thought she had put them in with her medication. At first, she was saddened by this, but then she waved goodbye. And she felt so good next to Leo that she thought, as it will be, so it will be. She was sure her husband would solve any problem with him. She would not have to think about her daily bread, or about the fact that the child lacked something. In this corner of paradise, Helen felt as if she had rested for all the past years. She felt truly loved and desired. So she didn't want to go back to normal life. But Leo had promised her another surprise, and he was not wrong in promising that his house would make her admire him. She hadn't expected her husband to be such a wealthy man. It was a beautiful mansion on the outskirts of town. It wasn't exactly a high-profile place. It's not the waterfront, but it's near the woods. You could look at it and reminisce about your wedding trip. High, low fence, automatic opening doors. "I'll be safe for you here," Leo said. "No one's gonna steal you away from me. Who needs me?" Helen started to pay and went to look at her new possessions. The house was not that big. A kitchen on the first floor and a living room on the first floor. 3 rooms, bedroom, study. And the third one Leo said would be a nursery. Last of all, he showed her the basement. Most of it was set up as a gymnasium. There was also a small room. According to Leo, Helen's eyes shone for storage of all kinds of junk. She mentally envisioned making this the most beautiful house in the world. She didn't know exactly how much Leo earned, but she was sure that she would have enough for various transformations. And she'd be working soon, too. "Don't you have some blag to find me a place?" she asked at dinner. Helen always tried to turn dinner into a little celebration. Not only cooked something tasty, but also beautifully set. Our table. She'd set glasses, pour wine and talk. Under such a feast was usually the most pleasant. But now Leo looked up at her in surprise. "Why do you have to work?" Helen was confused. "I always thought that I should not sit on my neck." "You're not sitting on my neck. I always thought I'd patronize and pamper my wife. She wouldn't have to work for someone else's uncle and put up with his whims." Helen was very pleased to hear this, and the conversation ended there. A week later, however, the young woman returned to him. Now Leo went to work every morning, and Helen spent the whole day alone. In addition, her husband always returned at different times. "You can't guess what time to make dinner so that everything is hot." "I'm thinking of getting a job," she said. She poured her husband coffee again and added, "Well, I'm here all day by myself. You're not going to watch TV or read all day long, are you? I should at least get my license. I could go to a friend's house or shopping. And if you were babysitting, you'd be bored too." Leo looked at her carefully. "But that's another matter." Helen even laughed. "My familiar girls say that the first time after childbirth, and so you go like a zombie with one single dream to sleep. So why should you get a job now and then go straight to maternity leave?" Leo asked. "But I still want to finish the institute first. You can't even imagine. What a disappointment it will be for Dad if I don't have a diploma." Helen protested. "Dad lives only for his science." Leo shrugged, and a few days later Helen took a test and found out she was pregnant. Leo organized a real celebration. Helen wanted to invite Sophia, her closest friend, but he objected. "This is the most important moment in our family's life. We don't need outsiders." But there were flowers and very expensive champagne and ice cream. Helen's favorite sweet, which she preferred to cakes and pastries. Leo immediately said that she would be observed and give birth in a private clinic. No flow doctor who will behave from the beginning and up to the delivery. The most attentive attitude separate room. Of course, Helen could not help but be grateful to her husband for such care. But privacy has already begun. A little burdensome for her. However, the doctor who brought her, Leo sent Helen to all sorts of examinations, and the results were not too pleased. "And you look healthier and stronger than you really are. But things aren't going so well. Something's threatening the baby. Is Helen scared?" "Not if you follow all the recommendations. The doctor said to stick to bed rest. At any moment, you could become dizzy, uncoordinated. You should be able to sit or lie down." "I see." Leo, who was present during the examination, asked his wife affectionately, "So you can't leave the house, dear? And just in case you don't run away, I'll take away your keys." He turned the matter into a joke. But soon Helen actually discovered that a set of keys was missing from her purse. "It's not funny," she said. "You're missing your husband for a long time. I might need something. It's not like I'm going to turn into a forge with no freedom. When the baby comes, everything will change." He promised her, and Helen had to accept it. Leo locked the gate securely when he left in the mornings. So Helen really felt like a prisoner trapped within four walls. "But at least I can have visitors." She couldn't stand it. Leo raised his eyebrows. "Who do you want to see?" "At least Sophia. It's been forever since we've met." He thought for a few moments. "Okay, invite her over for the weekend when I'm home too." Sunday night went wonderfully. Sophia had brought good wine and some toys for the baby to grow up with, she joked. The couple gave her a tour of the house, and then all sat together on the rug in the living room, lapping light sweet wine and talking. The terms of the news had piled up. Helen, too, wanted to talk about her life, to complain about how much she missed her. But Leo was sitting next to her. It was kind of uncomfortable in front of him. If he'd gone somewhere, well, even for a quarter of an hour. But he wouldn't leave his girlfriends. True, he behaved with extraordinary gallantry and tried to charm Sophia. The only moment they had alone together was when Sophia asked to go to the bathroom. "I'll show you the bathroom." Helen jumped up. "How do you live?" Sophia asked. As she slept, nodded her hands. Even if Leo stood under the door from behind the noise of the water, he heard nothing. Everything is normal. Well, yeah, pretty much. Helen really wanted to tell her how much she longed, but she was afraid Sophia wouldn't understand. After all, the way she was living now was dictated by Leo's care for her. "I thought you were locked up like a bird in a cage." "No," Sophia asked obliquely. "He's a good macho guy, but if you decide to run away from him, I understand. And by the way, if you want, you can stay at my place." Sophia had a small apartment, a studio, where she had lovingly designed every corner. There was room for bookshelves, a good record player, and even a small bar. And the loggia Sophia spotted and arranged there a working office, combined with a greenhouse. But only a baby crib will not fit there. And yet Helen had tears in her eyes. Sophia, it turns out, understood her. "Thank you," she whispered. That same evening, when she went to bed, Helen asked her husband, "Can Sophia come to visit us more often? I have more fun with her. I won't have to ask to go anywhere." If she was hoping to take her husband away, she was wrong. "Your girlfriend will not come to our house again," Leo said. "Why not?" Helen was stunned. "You should have thought of bringing wine to a pregnant woman." "I hardly ever drink." Helen justified herself. "You don't need a glass, but I wouldn't let you have more. If she shows up next time without me, how do I know what she's carrying? Maybe a bottle of whiskey. I assure you she wouldn't think twice. And I say what would. You're a kind soul. You don't know how jealous people can be. If something happened to your baby, your Sophia will comfort you. And in your heart you'll be glad it happened. You don't think she's jealous of you now. That you have a husband, a nice house, that you're pregnant, and that she has a job and a room the size of a dog kennel. I bet she drinks a lot and is willing to sleep with anyone she meets." Helen was hit by a wave of icy indignation. "You don't know her at all," she said coldly. "You haven't told me anything about your family. When I asked about it, you gave me complicated answers. But I can tell you about my family. I had no mother. I grew up with a stepmother. I never had a sister. Well, Sophia is the sister I've been missing my whole life. And she successfully dragged you to all sorts of companies, all sorts of bad places. What kind of hot spots? I'm imagining things. If we went to coffee shops or nightclubs, then I'm in the clear. You do realize what kind of people go there, right? Men come to eat girls like this." "I'm a girl," Helen said. "I didn't say that, but with that dog you could act like a girl. Look, I'm not asking you where exactly you work or who you're around. You know I run a security firm. And it's all men. So maybe you're hooking up with them." Romans asked Helen in anger. He slapped her on the cheek. No one had ever hit her before. And to raise a hand on a pregnant woman. Helen recoiled and cried. "There is no greater insult to a man than what you just said to me." Leo walked out, slamming the door. Helen cried for a long time, but the room was so quiet, not a single sound coming from the room, and she gradually began to calm down. The very surroundings had a calming effect on her. It was so beautiful in her room. Everything in soft pink colors. In the end, she came to realize that it was largely her own fault. Men have certain red lines they can't cross. And she had apparently violated the unspoken prohibition. Still, Helen thought that her husband would apologize to her, and she would try to forget the horrible scene. She and her husband spent the night apart. Helen fell into an unexpectedly deep sleep after many tears. She woke up several times, and each time she checked to see if Leo was there. It seemed to her that he must be there. After all, loving people always understand if they have hurt someone else and try to earn forgiveness, even if they are not guilty. But Leo did not come. In the morning, Helen heard that her husband was going to work. She couldn't believe that he was going for nothing. Besides, she wanted to eat too. So she casually walked into the kitchen where he was finishing breakfast, poured herself a cup of coffee, and made a sandwich. "What should I buy today?" Leo asked, as if nothing was wrong. "Will you write a list?" She usually gave him a shopping list with her, except for the very first few days when she was nauseous. So it lay in a thumb drive, But now Helen opened her eyes in surprise. It was as if Leo had forgotten everything that had happened yesterday. "You hit me," she said. And I was surprised at him. It just couldn't have happened. "You had a bad dream." "Don't you remember anything?" "No," I shook my head. "But if I upset you, I'm sorry. So what should I buy today?" Helen made a short list of groceries. When her husband left, she wanted to lounge on the couch with her phone, as usual. She was used to reading books from digital libraries lately, but she couldn't find her cell phone. In vain. She looked for it all over the room, checked the bathroom, looked in every nook and cranny in the living room and kitchen. There was no cell phone. She remembered that there was a landline in the house and decided to call her own cell phone from it. Then she would hear a familiar tune and find the missing cell phone. But it turned out that the landline phone was disconnected. That day, Helen was unusually bored. She didn't know what to do until her husband arrived. She had long since weaned herself off the television. Walking was only possible in the small garden. You can't go beyond the fence. The gate is locked. Shit, she can't even contact Sophia. If the cell phone is somehow lost, Sophia could buy a new one, and she would give her friend the money later. When Leo arrived in the evening, the first thing Helen asked him was if he knew where the phone was. Though in her heart she was sure he would answer no. All the more startled by his words. "You don't want the phone." "How's that?" She sat like that. "You'll be calling your friends, talking about your life to me. And I don't want anyone dragging my name around. Especially not dirty girls like Sophia. And you say you don't remember the scene last night." Helen summarized bitterly. "I'm afraid it will be exactly the same today. I don't know what you mean, but all that cell phone service and radiation. I don't think it's good for the baby." Helen laughed, but it sounded almost hysterical. "Look, this isn't the Stone Age, and everyone has a cell phone. I don't part with mine." And I know his voice was calm, like he was talking to a baby, but it's not good for you. Look at you now, your nerves are shot, and I need to keep you safe from any anxiety. Give me the phone, and I'll calm down. I brought you something else." Leo went out and came back with a small flat box. "You say you mostly read books on the internet? I bought you an ebook, and at my request, they put 100 detectives and love stories in it. When you read it, everyone tells me I'll announce your library, but that's not what this is. Do you have a TV for the news? What else do you need? I need to be able to contact someone. You're out all day. What if something happens to me? Get sick? I'd have to call an ambulance to get you out of work. Now I won't leave you so long." Leo said affectionately, "I'll stop by in the middle of the day to see if you're all right." And he did visit her once or twice a day. He always came at different times, and he didn't stay long, sometimes only for a few minutes, to make sure everything was all right. Helen panted, wandering around the rooms. An e-book couldn't replace the internet for her. She realized that she had complained about loneliness for nothing before. She could sit on forums, chat in chat rooms. She could contact the same Sophia through social networks. Now she was deprived of all that. The books her husband had downloaded for her were cheap reading and couldn't occupy her thoughts. Does he really care about me that much? She asked herself, but it's really choking me. Hormones were probably affecting her too, because she didn't recognize herself. Every now and then she started crying like a hurt child and felt very unhappy. A few days later, Helen told her husband, "I can't go on like this. I'm leaving you." He was just finishing his lunch and gave a marvelous green pea. Leo raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Where are you going to go? Shouldn't you care?" She answered defiantly. "I understand," he said calmly. Now he spoke with more than just that tone. "You wanted to live with your Sophia until the divorce was finalized, and then have a baby, get a job, and get child support. I painted the right picture. So what? 1,000 women live like that?" Helen twitchy chin. "But you're not going to live like that. First of all, you're not going anywhere because you're carrying my baby, and I'm not going to give you the opportunity to steal it from me. I'm not going to steal." Helen realized for the first time that her husband might not just let her go. Just like that. "Will you be able to see him?" He shook his head. "I don't like it. But don't you realize what's made me unhappy? You're not yourself right now. Leo took his time and poured coffee for both of them. Then when the baby comes, you'll think you're crazy for a while. It's okay, it'll get better. You'll see that you can't stop me from leaving. You're a free man, but so am I. Are you sick now? Leo tried to stroke his wife's arm, but she pulled her back. The sick are taken care of without asking for their consent. I will leave, Helen said not so confidently. No, you won't. But if you want to, you can try. When did Leo leave? Helen walked around the castle one more time and realized that her husband was right. Maybe a man trained and physically strong would be able to get out of here. But not a pregnant woman whose eyes darken every now and then and for whom physical effort is contraindicated. The wall is high and topped with metal peaks. She has no phone now. The gate is on an automatic lock. The house is set back from the other buildings, and there's no way that if she screams, anyone will hear her. And besides, it would be a lot easier for Leo to make her look crazy. Helen remembered an acquaintance who had an elderly mother. Emily would go to work in the mornings, and the old lady would open the window and scream that she was being murdered. Called her daughter for help. Her greatest fear was that her mother would fall out. So she finally put bars on the windows. The mother was sedated, but nothing worked. Her screams echoed down the street. Another thing, the neighbors were aware of what was going on and did not rush old ladies to help. Nevertheless, Helen tried to climb up to the attic. The roof of the house was flat, and part of it was a kind of observation platform. But Leo had made provision for that. The entrance to the attic was locked. The young woman cried once again. In her heart, she hoped that she would somehow find a way to escape and would be among her own people today. But it turned out that escape would have to be postponed until later. As a last resort, she would run away from the maternity hospital. Better yet, she'll tell everyone around her. The doctor, the nurses, the women in labor. That Leo turned the house into a prison. He's kept her imprisoned her entire pregnancy, and now needed to help her sneak out of the maternity ward with the baby. Helen didn't much care where she went. She could stay at Sophia's for a while. Cramped, but not too cramped. Then maybe she could find some work so that she could afford a nanny for the baby. At the very least, she'll move in with her father. He wouldn't kick her out of the house. Thoughts of her father brought her back to the institute, which Helen had forgotten all about. Her father still thinks she's studying, doesn't he? He sends her money for the apartment, and it is saved on her card. But Leo has the card too, as well as all family documents, passports, policies. He hid them all in the home safe under the pretext that Helen's absent-mindedness is not worth losing documents at the most inopportune moment. When we get to the maternity hospital, we'll find out that you left everything at home and can't remember where your passport is. That's when Leo was telling her all this. His words had sounded like a joke, but now Helen realized that she was the door behind which she was, figuratively speaking, locked. Another shift appeared. It would be okay if she could get away. Sophia will give her money for a cab, and her father won't ask for his own daughter's papers. If Leo won't give her passport back, Helen will recover it later. She'll say she lost it. In the meantime, maybe try another way to give up food. If she goes on a hunger strike, Leo will have to do what she wants. After all, he's so looking forward to this baby. He will not allow Helen to starve. It could be bad for the baby. And on this day, she didn't make dinner. When her husband returned, Helen sat in her room on the wide windowsill and looked out of the window. It was raining. There was a fence and wet lilac bushes in front of her eyes. She knew her husband was about to make sure there was nothing to eat if he made a scandal. Well, Helen was ready for that. Instead, Leo was rattling around in the kitchen. Half an hour later, he walked in on her. "Let's go to dinner. Everything's on the table." "I'm not hungry," Helen said without turning from the window. "You don't feel well." He became alarmed. "Can you take it that way? There's hot soup and rolls waiting for you. Coffee, of course." Helen was very hungry, but she was sure she could stand it, and only shook her head negatively, saying, "I won't go." "If you don't break the regimen," Leo kept talking to her like a child, "we'll go out this weekend. We'll walk in the park, have ice cream. You've really been away from home, haven't you?" Helen couldn't believe her ears. Leo couldn't realize that when she was outside the gate, she would leave him immediately. She'd jump out of the car. For that matter. Yeah, he nodded. I'm not kidding. Well said, Helen. I'll be right down. She cleaned herself up a bit, washed her face, and changed her pajamas for a robe. She didn't like to walk around, unraveled. But until this minute, her mood had been so bad that she didn't feel like doing anything. Now it was different. So pull yourself together, her husband said to her at dinner. If you don't feel well, of course we won't go anywhere. But if everything will be normal, then I intend to treat you a little. Shall we go to the store and get you something? You'll soon be able to wear the clothes you're used to. It was Monday, and all week Helen had behaved exemplarily. Now she had no doubt that she would be free before the deadline. She did the usual household chores, and at the same time her head was full of thoughts. If Sophia had guessed and come to her house when her husband was away, they could have talked over the fence. Maybe somehow a friend could give her the phone. But in any case, Sophia wouldn't refuse to take her in. Helen had no doubt about that. On Saturday morning, Helen looked at her husband, as if asking what their plans were for the day. Unfortunately, I'm being called into work today, Leo said. Getting my second cup of coffee. Do you remember what you promised me? The young woman couldn't stand it. What did he pretend not to remember? But then he laughed. Of course, I know how much you're looking forward to it. Let's go tomorrow right from the morning. It was rainy on Sunday, but Leo was not going to cancel the trip. First, he brought Helen to the country square. The rain had already stopped freezing, but there was not a single person in the alleys. The young woman was very disappointed at this circumstance. If she just tried to run away from Leo here, he would catch up with her in a few seconds, and there was no one to turn to for help. At this time, the husband received a phone call. There is a slight change of plans, he told Helen. I have to be in the office now, but it dragged on interminably. You can go shopping by yourself. I'll give you the card, if you don't mind. Helen could only nod. I'll give you 2 hours. I'll call a cab, then I'll wait for you at home. Leo sat his wife down himself, pulled up his car, and gave the address Center City, the very street that was considered the center of big and small stores. Helen watched in the small mirror as her husband's figure moved away. Change of plans, she told the cab driver. As soon as the car rounded the corner, I'll stop by a friend's house first. If only she had ended up at Sophia's, she would have nothing more to fear. Helen didn't regret not bringing her things with her. Didn't care. She would get a job and be able to provide herself and the baby with the essentials. The main thing was to get out of this captivity. The cab driver shrugged his shoulders, saying he didn't care where he was taking her. And after a quarter of an hour, he stopped the car near the house where Sophia lived. Helen awkwardly got out of the cab. She had lost the gracefulness of her movements since the onset of her pregnancy. She still had to climb to the 3rd floor, and her heart was racing like a hare's. There was a slight odor of Wendy's in the stairwell, and Helen was overcome with nostalgia. It had always smelled like this in here. Sophia's neighbor old lady, Wendy, had a great deal of respect for it and put it generously in all the closets and commands. Helen pressed the bell button, imagining that in a few seconds her friend would open the door for her, and they would throw themselves around each other's necks. But no one rushed to open it. In vain, Helen called again and again with a falling heart. The young woman realized that her friend was not at home. She must have gone to the store somewhere. But she would wait for Sophia. There was no other way out. Helen lost the bag and sank down on the steps. When she heard the front door open, she was alarmed. It could have been Sophia. A few moments later, she couldn't believe her eyes. Leah was coming up the stairs. How did you find me? She asked, barely audibly. Honey, it was a test, and you didn't pass it. I had no doubt you would escape, though. And of course, I had no trouble guessing where. There's nowhere else to go. If you were smart, you'd get in a cab and go to your father's. But you're a poor, naive fool. Don't call Sophia. She's on vacation in the South, and I'm sure she's perfectly happy and doesn't think about you. And you knew she was away. Helen asked with just her lips. Of course I knew. Otherwise, I wouldn't have offered you that walk. What kind of a bitch are you? Now let's go home, calmly, Leo continued. Not long before, Helen was contemplating when she would go into labor, whether it would be possible to keep from screaming, to shout in front of everyone. It seemed very embarrassing to her. But now she was exactly screaming help. Leo squeezed her hand tightly. "You want me to call the psychiatric team? I have a friend who works there. He's aware of the problem and will come faster than the police. If you expect her to be called by the neighbors, a psychiatrist will tell the cops you have a diagnosis, and a caring husband will drive you. So I suggest you don't embarrass yourself and make yourself look crazy in front of a lot of other people." With her head down, Helen followed her husband. The tide of emotions was too strong. She felt sick, barely able to stand on her feet. Leo's car was parked in the driveway. He lifted his wife into the back seat like a thing in a mirror. Helen saw his grin. She closed her eyes and didn't open them the whole way. She really felt no longer a human being as a person as before, but an object, belonging to a master. Helen had become depressed. Not only did she not do household chores, but she would not leave her room, lying all day long, turning her back to the wall and keeping silent when she had to get up to go to the restroom. She felt herself weakening quickly, and it was a pleasant sensation. Helen wanted to sink into oblivion as soon as possible and leave this world that way. And the last thing she wanted was for Leo to disturb her and talk to her. The day came when he came and put a chair next to her bed and sat down. "It won't go on like this," he said. "If you don't eat, you won't last long." Helen twitched and, without turning around, made it clear that she didn't care. "Now you're definitely mentally ill," Leo continued. "And if you don't do something about it, you're not going to get better." "Let me go," Helen said. "Come with me." She got out of bed, listless, like a marionette. She no longer believed her husband. Leo held her hand tightly as they went down the stairs and then down another one to the basement. Helen wondered if she had the strength to make it upstairs. After all, and this was indifferent to her, what did it matter where she lay? Might as well be on the floor in the hall. In the basement, Leo opened the very door that was usually closed, for which his old things were kept, as he had said. Now Helen saw that the room was completely empty. A cage. Now her husband held Helen by both hands and spoke to her like a child. "If you behave as you do now, I won't be able to leave you alone. You understand? In your condition, you could hurt yourself. There's plenty of opportunity for that up there in the house. And I can't let anything happen to you and the baby. You keep going. You'll be seen by a psychiatrist friend of mine, prescribed pills, and you'll live here with all the furniture. Mattress, night potty is fine. You had this torture chamber specially set up?" she asked. "No," I shrugged. "It's not uncommon for mansions to have a secret room like this to hide in. If there's a break-in, a robbery, or some other emergency. This time it's my emergency. You're the one who wants to be medicated, so you'll lie there like a vegetable. Why do you need all this?" Helen didn't realize she was going to ask that question herself. Neither did Leo expect it. He was silent for a few moments. "Because you're mine," he finally said. "When you and I got married, you're the only one I belong to. I've never thought of leaving you or changing you, but you're always tearing yourself apart. But I won't let you go. You promised, Leo. But 1 million people get divorced." Helen said tiredly, "What makes you think our marriage is special? I think you're the one who's mentally ill, not me." "Be that as it may," he replied, holding back his anger. "Do you have to answer that question? Do you want to spend the time left before the birth in a human way? Or do you want to be locked up in here? Not humanly. It will be either way." Helen sighed. "You know, I don't care. It's up to you." "Okay," he said. "We'll give you another chance. Well, have something to eat tonight. Let's go upstairs." And Leo helped his wife up the steps, overcome that she couldn't do it alone. Helen knew she had to wait for the birth, but she could not have imagined the shock that awaited her. The young woman had packed a bag in advance with things she might need at the hospital. If Leo wished to check on her, well, there were no secrets. Nightgowns, hygiene items, a few books. And yet, as Helen looked at that bag, it represented to her the hope that she would be able to get out of here soon. But when it was time to go to the hospital, Leo said, "Will you give birth at home, dear?" Helen looked up, and there was pain in her eyes, as if he had hit her again. "Yes, yes," her husband went on. "The doctor is on his way. What is it that you don't like? In the old days, only the poor gave birth in maternity hospitals, and the rich had midwives. It was the order of the day, so I've organized this luxury for you. What kind of luxury is that? Helen bit her lip in pain. What about sterility? What if something goes wrong and you need an operation? There's no facilities at home. If there are problems, then we'll deal with them, Leo said nonchalantly. You're young, healthy. Everything should go as it should. To be honest, Helen soon didn't care who her doctor was, whether sterility would be assured for the next few hours. She felt like she was dying. The pain was so intense that the paramedics who arrived had to give her anesthesia. Maybe they did it out of mercy? Or maybe Leo had insisted, not wanting his wife's screams to be heard on the street. Even though their house was on the edge of the woods, it was still the edge of the street. When Helen came to, she didn't immediately realize where she was. Nothing hurt. It was blissfully light. For a while, she thought she had returned to her childhood and was lying on her bed in her parents' house. Then her vision began to focus and she saw a dark red that it took another effort to remember everything. Someone entered the room. Helen turned her head and saw Leo's face. His was as fearless and calm as ever, unbelievable. Who was born? Barely audible, she asked. We have a baby girl. Show her to me, Helen asked, and mentally added not at us, but at me. Then said Leo, I want you to show her to me. Helen's old stubbornness was definitely back. After all, it was me who gave birth to her. Now you get some sleep, and then I'll show her to you, Leo promised. Helen knew it was useless to ask, and she was in no condition to get up and leave to look for her daughter right now. She was very weak. As soon as she closed her eyes, she fell, either into sleep or unconsciousness. Leo did not deceive her when Helen woke up feeling better. Leo had brought her baby. Helen was afraid to hold her daughter in her arms, such a small, tiny newborn head. It required careful support. Is she all right? Helen asked, not noticing she was crying. She put her daughter to her breast. What did the doctors say? The girl is healthy. Let there be faith, Helen decided, gazing into the baby's face. She didn't need hope. It was something shaky and uncertain, driving happiness crazy. She needed a firm belief that they would both get out of this nightmare quest. Leo agreed nicely. There was no crib in the room, and as the newborn napped, Helen began to look around helplessly, where to put her. Let me carry the baby to her room. Leo held out his arms. I want her to live with me. Helen slowly. Okay, tomorrow we'll move the crib in here and move everything around. But you need to sleep well tonight so you won't be woken up by baby cries. You need to rest. Don't you realize I can hear her from any room? But still Helen gave her husband the baby. And he was right. Her strength was so exhausted that she slept soundly and dreamlessly that night. When she woke up in the morning, she realized she could try to get up. Leo brought her breakfast. Coffee, toast, jam, eggs. Bring it, Emily, demanded Helen. And noticing the strange expression on his face, she threatened him, or I'll definitely go on a hunger strike. Emily no longer lives in this house, he said. What? Helen's heart literally stopped. Don't be so scared. She's still doing fine. Only she will live somewhere else and other people will take care of her. And if you want to see her someday, you don't do anything stupid. That's the surest way to keep you in line, he added with a chuckle. Helen looked at him with horror. Are you a human being? She asked, shocked. And who is? Was there a grin on his face? You're just a crazy sadist. I understand that you are excited. There have been so many changes in your life yet, but I still control my behavior and my words. Unless you want to spend the rest of your life in an insane asylum. That's where you won't be seen, Emily. Her husband bowed slightly and left. From that day on, personal hell began for Helen. After a tantrum so violent she could have died or gone mad. There was a breakdown in her character. It was like she lost her will. She became submissive like a dog that wants to earn its master's approval. She now lived day by day, fulfilling all his wishes, so that on the first of every month he threw on her lap another picture of Emily. Here is the baby learning to lift her head, to roll over, to sit up. Here she was taking her first timid steps, stepping along the couch. Helen tried to understand where her daughter was, based on the surroundings. But only a white wall was in the photographer's field of vision, and this very worn cherry-colored couch. And of course, the baby. Helen had no doubt that it was her daughter, even though she had only seen the little girl once. It was undoubtedly her. Helen recognized Emily's face as her own. Same nose shape, slit, and eye color. Except that the girl's hair was blonde, like Leo's. From the outside, it might have seemed that Helen's situation was now better. She began to leave the house invariably in the company of her husband. But still now the two of them were seen in cafes, stores, 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 and parks. But Helen saw this freedom as a humiliation. If before she had nurtured in herself hatred for her husband and considered him crazy, now she was forced to pretend to be a happy wife. Leo had warned her if she tried the antics he said she would never see the baby again. And Helen knew her husband was capable of carrying out his threat, even if she managed to get to the police. And Leo would be apprehended. He just wouldn't reveal the secret where the girl was. How long would this torture last? Helen asked herself longingly, would it ever end? Would her husband abuse her? A year, 2, 3, or a lifetime? Her psyche was teetering on the brink. Helen was afraid that such a life would make her lose her mind. Now she was bound to Leo much more firmly than before by the word, and hoped to see her daughter someday. She and Leo got into the habit of stopping by the supermarket on Saturday nights and buying groceries for the week. One time, Helen was selecting an item in the dairy department, and Leo walked a little farther to pull a bottle of wine off the shelves. The unfamiliar young man quickly passed the young woman, but also dropped a carton of milk into her cart. Helen opened her mouth in surprise at first, then saw Sophia in the back of the store in the distance, making a hand sign to her. Everything was going as it should. Helen nodded involuntarily. They were not allowed to approach each other. Leo would stop it immediately, and there was no telling what Helen's punishment would be. Maybe he would lock her in the basement or beat her up again. He often raised his hand to her. Helen was used to enduring the pain. She didn't scream or cry now. She only flinched like a dog being kicked by a cruel master. When she and Leo arrived home, the first thing Helen did was look at the milk carton, and her pencil had written, "Your father is dying. No hope calling to say goodbye." And then all the skills Helen had recently acquired went out the window. She rushed to her husband. "I have to go home," she begged. He raised his eyebrows. "Why? Is father dying? I haven't seen him in years. I can never forgive myself if I don't say goodbye to him. You're not the ultimate monster. Let me go for a few days and I'll be back. I swear to you, or let's go together." He grabbed her chin. "How do you know about your father? Tell me," she blurted it out. It was the first thing that popped into her head. "I met a friend at the store," she said. "Don't lie." He didn't believe it for a second. "First of all, you weren't talking to anyone there. Secondly, if someone had told you about your father, you'd have told me right away. And you only found out about it now. Someone handed you the phone, wrote you a note. Tell me." Helen didn't see any other choice but to lay it on the line, did she? Maybe then he'd take pity and let her go to her father. She showed him the ill-fated box. "I see," he squinted. "You're not going anywhere. Father can die just fine without you. Leo, for God's sake." Helen knelt in front of her husband. "You realize you'll do a terrible thing if you don't let me go. Fate can forgive a lot of things, but it punishes for such things. The boomerang will come and it'll be interesting to watch." His tone hasn't even changed. It was just as cold and mocking. "And for being so eager to deceive me. Next month there will be no pictures of you with." Helen had a terrible tantrum in her memory. She sobbed for hours locked in her room. And when she did want to come out, she realized that Leo's intention was not to let her out anytime soon. She spent about a week alone. It was good that the bedroom was connected to the bathroom. At least Helen was not thirsty. Her husband didn't bring her any food. It was a real prison. There were bars on the windows to keep out burglars. The view was of a high fence with a forest beyond. Helen didn't know when she would be released, but when Leo got the call to report that her father had died, her husband purposely came to the door so she could hear his voice. Leo expressed his condolences and said that unfortunately he and Helen could not make it to the funeral. Very busy with work. Well, as soon as they have a moment to spare, they'll come and look at it. It seemed like a week. Helen felt that her mind was tormented, and she could not tell exactly how many days had passed when Leo opened the door, could go downstairs and eat something. After that, Helen finally broke down. She became apolitical and indifferent to everything. She didn't care whether she stayed at home or followed her husband, and wherever he led her, keeping her head down. She did her homework, but she did it thorough as an automaton. When the housework was finished, she would sit or lie motionless, looking at one point. You couldn't tell whether she was immersed in her thoughts or in prostration. When Leo spoke to her, she answered him, but she answered the question. It was impossible to get a word out of her now. The question remained, why would he want such a broken doll? But it was as if he was satisfied that he had brought her to such a state that she walked like a mannequin without feelings, thoughts, and desires. That he had complete power over her. Something human appeared in Helen's gaze only when her husband placed another photograph of his daughter in front of her. She would stare at her for a long time, and the expression in her eyes would become sad, as if she were mentally talking to Emily. Then she put the pictures in the album and put it in someone's drawer. She knew that if she kept pulling out and looking at the pictures, Leo would throw the album away. Just like he destroyed everything she cared about, so she would pick up the album once a month just to put another picture in it. And so the years went by. One day, in a conversation between the couple, the number 18 came up. When Emily turns 18, I'll tell you. And then she'll decide for herself if she wants to see you. And if she does, I won't object. Helen decided to think of this day as the tipping point of her imprisonment, after which she would either have her freedom and her daughter, or she would be gone. Now she knew that it was possible not to make any effort for this not to take any sin on her soul. She would leave simply out of longing and despair. In the last month before that date, she knitted a beautiful blue shawl. It had once been her favorite color, and she hoped her daughter would like it. On the cherished day, she gave Leo the shawl package, asking him to give it to Emily for me. He grinned, but took the package. That day, he didn't come home for a long time. Helen had no doubt that he had gone to Faith. After all, she is his daughter after all, and celebrating her coming of age. When she heard the house gate open in the evening, she ran downstairs. Well, she asked. He could have taunted her by demanding, for example, that she serve him dinner first. But Leo would not do that. He handed her the package. Emily doesn't want to know you. Why not? Helen whispered with just her lips. Did you tell her what you did to me? And I told her you left her. And now you're sorry and you want to make amends. I never said a word to her about you before. Helen herself did not expect what would happen. Then she threw herself at her husband, forgetting everything. She beat him with her fists ineptly and desperately, and screamed like a man who had been hurt intolerably and painfully. Leo was so unaware of this that after only a few seconds he came to his senses, and twisted his wife, and dragged her down to the basement. Helen was lying on the floor. It was very difficult for her to move. She didn't even want to raise her head, not even to turn it. The only thing the woman wanted was for everything to end here and now. She knew that Leo had locked the door from the outside. Or rather, there was an English lock. Her husband pushed her inside and slammed the door shut. Sooner or later he would open it or he wouldn't. It was all the same. When Helen tried to pull herself up, her head fell helplessly to the floor and her broken nose bled again. But Leo had never beaten her to the point of mutilating her. One has to think now, too. Nothing was fixable. It hadn't happened. Just a cruel lesson. After a while, she'd be able to walk again like she used to. But things happened differently than Helen had envisioned. When the door swung open and Leo saw his wife, he even apparently thought he had overdone it. He walked over to her and bent over. Later, Helen felt as if it was not she who had acted, but some force. Instead, she tore at her husband's leg, in a sudden, sharp movement. and when he lost his balance for a few moments, she jumped up and dashed for the door. Only when the lock clicked behind her back, her tormentor still inside, did she catch her breath. Helen heard her husband banging on the door and shouting something, but she also knew that the door was tight and secure. Not something even a man could just kick down. Nevertheless, she couldn't allow herself to gather herself quietly. Acting quickly, she frantically changed into jeans and a thin sweater. She threw on a jacket, shoved a few changes of underwear and the essentials into her bag. She knew where the money and her husband's card were. She didn't need to cover her tracks. On the contrary, she wanted Leo to be punished. The money, the files. Everything seemed to be in place. An ordered cab pulled up. Helen gave her friend's address. If she wasn't at home, she should go to the hospital. We weren't home. She aghast when she saw Helen with her bat on the doorstep. The friends hugged and cried, and could not unclasp the embrace. Then Sophia oiled the abrasions. Helen applied ice to the biggest bruise. She made a sandwich and a cup of strong coffee. She wanted to pour brandy, but Helen stopped her. No, don't. First, you have to go to the hospital to get the bruises removed, and then to the police. That's what the friends did. Sophia didn't leave Helen alone. She held her hand. Helen felt like Leo was about to appear behind her, calling out to her. Right on top of him, she heard his voice and picked herself up time after time. Again, there was no way for him to get out of the secret room by himself. Helen had finished telling her story to Alex, and now sat looking at the sea. What happened next? He asked, silently. Next, the police came to Leo's house. He was released from his confinement and immediately detained. There was a trial. He got less time than I expected, only 2 years. That is, he was given more, but released after 2 years. When I found out about it, I immediately left town to come here. I'll have to go back soon. How have you been living all this time? Turns out my father left me a nice inheritance. And I also found out that Leo had deposited a large sum of money into my account. Some money was no problem. That's good, because I couldn't work for a while. I was in treatment. I was very close to losing my mind. Maybe that's why they gave Leo a little bit of a pass. They thought I was crazy and that I was talking about him a lot. The beatings really couldn't be hidden. And your daughter? My ex-husband never said where she was. Not with the police, not in court. Helen shook her head, so I don't know anything. Wasn't he charged with kidnapping? He made it look like there was no baby, Helen said. There wasn't. And it's all in my sick imagination. It's a miracle that thanks to the testimony of Sophia and other people I know, it was possible to prove that he deprived me of my freedom. Why was he released so early? Alex was trying to figure it out. It doesn't make sense. I bought an apartment, said Helen. I had to have somewhere to live. But now I don't know how I'm going to get back. He'll be walking the streets of the same city. He won't leave me alone. I think he's got some kind of obsession with me. Don't you want to move? Asked Alex to another city. Start from scratch again. A naked man on bare ground. I don't have the strength for that. My father died with my stepmother and my siblings. I don't keep in touch. I only have a few girlfriends, and now I will be forced to leave them. But when I found out he was released, I became panicky, afraid to come home, to go into an empty apartment. I feel like they're waiting for me there, waiting for the door to open, for him to come out. When do you have to go back? Asked Alex. In 3 days, answered Helen. Alex's decision to move in with Helen was met by the young man's parents in a flurry. I didn't think I would live to see this, said the mother, making me remember scenes from novels. You realize that after this, no one will respect you. Getting involved with a woman 20 years older than you. Mom, how many times have I told you I'm not having an affair with Helen? Alex wasn't so hot-headed anymore. He said those words in a tired tone. She just needs help right now. Who are you trying to fool? She's a rich woman. She can hire any help she wants, not ask a student who has no extra time. We have to learn. Even if we believed you, no one will. You be labeled as someone who can be bought. And no decent girl. Maybe it's my problem finding girls. Alex was starting to get hot. You've already found one, my mother parried. That lady should retire soon. I understand her desire to find a young boy. Alex was packing his things, trying to control himself. Stop it. Father turned to his mother. You are going to agree that Alex will not come to us. Do you understand him? Yes, man to man, Mother couldn't calm down. This Helen is my age. Let me get another student instead of you. What would you say then? The father switched to his son. If you don't want to live with us, maybe just rent an apartment. We'll help you pay for it. A lot of guys your age are living with girls. Why do you have such a strange choice? Are you going to drop out? Alex was already standing in the doorway. I'll drop out if everyone needs me while I'm in. He found it easier to breathe outside. Helen lived in a new house in the heart of the city. It overlooked a square. You could admire the fountains. Sitting on the loggia with a cup of coffee. Alex, the university was a short walk from here. Walking distance. He could be grateful to Helen for a separate room with its own balcony and all the furnishings of his dwelling. Not at all comparable to his parents' modest apartment. But he could see that she needed him more than she was letting on about it. Helen stayed out of his life completely, but she cared. Alex took a sabbatical and got a job. In the morning, when he was about to leave, she would make him coffee and make him something to eat, even though he asked her not to worry and not to get up so early. She would sit against him in the kitchen, watching him eat and smiling slightly. If he didn't speak himself, she was silent with her. But it was surprisingly easy to keep silent with Helen, as if we were on the same wavelength. He came rather late. When the fall came, it was already beginning to get dark. And again, they would sit together at the table. And there was Helen's incomparable coffee in small cups. And Alex more words from the left in the evening, often humorously told about how his day went. There was nothing to tell about Helen, except about books read and movies watched. But Alex noticed that she became calmer around him. Her face rounded a little. She lost her painful thinness. Her hair began to grow. Helen went to the hairdresser, made a hairstyle that suited her more than before. She even found a hobby. She started growing flowers. By the time she became a winter girl, the apartment was like a winter garden. I guess it was the earth that had drawn her to the land as she got older. Helen shrugged his shoulders. Returning, Alex often saw such a picture. Helen sits in an armchair, as if in a green thunderstorm of branches beating all over. Softly speaking sconces, and the woman is reading a book. Alex involuntarily noted that the woman remained beautiful, despite all that she had been through. If I ever get married, I would like such a mother-in-law, he thought, feeling that Helen gradually becomes for him a native person. But sometimes, when he woke up in the middle of the night, he saw a light in the kitchen. And that means that Helen again had a terrible dream, in which the door quietly opens and her ex-husband enters. And now until morning, she will sit, drink coffee, and listen. Would there be footsteps on the stairs? She realized that these were far-fetched fears, but she couldn't help it. From Leo's house, Helen had taken nothing with her except her personal belongings, a photo album, and a blue shawl she had knitted for her daughter. The shawl now hung in her room. Alex did not hide from her that he was trying to find her husband and daughter. But he didn't tell her the details. And when the young man disappeared for days at a time, Helen knew it had something to do with the search, but she never questioned it. It was too painful and intolerable for her to hope and then be disappointed. And so the year passed. Helen wanted to talk to Alex about his plans for the summer. She herself wanted to go somewhere to the north, maybe to Karelia. She couldn't stand the heat, and she thought if the young man wanted to, he could accompany her. If he has a girlfriend, let him take her with him. She's paying for the young people's room. Alex's presence gave her a semblance of family, but she didn't have time to talk about it. The day came when Alex knocked on her room. I need to talk to you. Helen looked up with frightened eyes. Did you find out something bad? Leo found me. We have to leave. Will you let me sit down? Settled across from Helen in the chair. Alex began to speak. I found out why your ex-husband was released. Of course, not only in connection with it, but this circumstance also played a big role. Leo went blind. As Helen asked in a whisper. There, when he was serving time, there was a fight in the zone. He got beat up pretty bad. Concussion and blindness. He He was in the hospital for a long time, and he'll never see again. The doctors are sure he won't. But I wondered what he was. Why did he treat you like that? Because by the time you were married, he was already a wealthy, well-to-do man. And Emily, did you find out anything about Emily? Helen interrupted. Wait a minute. I was sure this behavior was more typical of someone from a marginalized background. But when I delved into all of this, he really had a rough childhood. After his father left, the family lived in blatant poverty. An old house, and there wasn't even heating with a stove and wood. The mother, whom Leo loved very much, began to drink first and then reached for other men. She would leave the house and spend the night somewhere. And the boy was left alone in the fuel rooms, sleeping in his jacket when she returned drunk, and often with some lonely woman bragging to her son about a new ring and a new dress. Leo asked Mom, "Why did you leave me for someone else?" "You have your whole life ahead of you," she said. "Mine is passing, and you can't give me anything right now, so don't judge me for taking from others." Maybe that's what gave him the incentive to get ahead at all costs and become a wealthy man. It was an attempt to prove something to his mother, but it failed. When Leo started earning well, his mother was already dead. A life of excess is no good. And when he met you, all his childhood complexes were realized. His mother didn't belong to him. She was always slipping away from him, swapping him for someone else. So he decided to make you all his, at any cost. At first, he thought you'd be his child. But then he realized you could leave with a baby in your arms. That's when he separated you and your daughter. He knew there was no better blackmail than a daughter. He may or may not give her back to you. And as long as he has the daughter, you'll be at his mercy. Then why did he take my hope away? He said Emily didn't want to hear from me. Alex shrugged. Maybe he was tired of playing this game for so many years. Maybe he just snapped. But he wasn't going to let you go for sure. In your face, he was definitely avenging his mother for his childhood. Where he hid his faith. That's what tormented Helen. Most of all, she's alive. He gave her to strangers to be adopted. Do you know anything about that? I know. Alex was silent for a few moments, and the woman held her breath. You have no idea who raised her. Who did? Your stepmother. He brought her the little girl and assured her that you had given her up. He's too busy with work to raise a girl. Maria really did love your father. Her own sons were grown, and she realized she couldn't give the professor's own granddaughter to an orphanage. So she raised Emily. Leo visited the girl, took pictures. Helen held her hand to her throat. She really hates me and doesn't want to know. She's at Maria's now. Come with me. Alex suggested it. I have something to show you. And I also want you to know this. I met with Vera and talked to her. Helen had long ago given the young man the keys to her car, and now the car was waiting for them at the entrance. From excitement, the woman did not realize where they were going. The city ended, the villages went on. Then the road turned into the forest. Finally, Alex stopped the car and shocked. Helen recognized the place where she and her husband had once spent their honeymoon. The cottage by the lake. It had recently rained and the air was filled with the smell of pine needles, earth, and leaves. There was a small pier next to the cottages. It was empty now. It seemed that there was not a single living soul here, but it only seemed so. Helen did not immediately see on the landing in front of the cottages in a chair sat a man from the worst with gray hair and dark glasses. Helen would not have recognized Leo, but reason told her that it was him. And standing next to him, leaning toward him, was a girl. She was saying something to the old man, stroking his arm. Then the girl threw her head down. She was as fair-haired as her mother. And with her noble features, she resembled her grandfather. For a minute, she and Helen looked back at each other. Helen wanted to walk toward Faith, but realized she couldn't move. Her legs were failing. Alex, apparently sensing her condition, took her firmly under the elbow. You are not angry that I decided to treat a little? He asked quietly. Helen did not immediately realize what he was talking about. Emily said something to her father and slowly walked towards them. The closer the girl came, the more Helen's doubts grew. No tests were needed here, no questions asked. This was her baby girl, the one she had given birth to and held in her arms only once in her life. About 10 paces away, Emily stopped. And only now Helen noticed that on the girl's shoulders lay a blue fishnet bundle. The handkerchief was the same one that had hung in Helen's room a while ago, and looking at which she believed that she would give it to her daughter someday.